You speak English, don't you? Then mop faster. The words sliced through the marble lobby like shattered glass, sharp enough to draw blood from anyone within earshot. Evelyn Hartman didn't whisper her contempt. She broadcast it, her voice echoing off imported Italian columns, while a janitor stood frozen with his mop, water pooling at his feet. Around them, foreign investors shifted uncomfortably, their laughter forced and hollow. But the real violence wasn't in her words. It was in how easily she looked through him, as if humanity itself could be erased by a uniform and a bucket. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the man she'd just humiliated understood every language being spoken in that room. Every lie, every cultural mistake about to cost her empire billions. And in 72 hours, he would be the only person who could save her. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Caleb Moore had learned a long time ago that silence was a kind of armor. He'd worn it through foster homes where speaking up earned bruises. Through classrooms where teachers praised his surprising intelligence with the same tone they might use for a dog that learned to sit. Through hospital waiting rooms where his mother's diagnosis came wrapped in medical jargon designed to intimidate people who couldn't afford to push back. Silence became his language, more fluent than the 6 others he'd taught himself from library books and late-night radio broadcasts. But silence, he'd also learned, could be a weapon. The lobby of Hartman Global Industries stretched before him like a cathedral built to worship money. 40-foot ceilings. Chandeliers that cost more than his mother's lifetime medical bills. Security guards in suits nicer than anything he'd ever owned. Caleb pushed his cleaning cart across marble so polished he could see his reflection. A lean black man in his early 30s, janitor's uniform pressed but faded, moving through the space like a ghost. He liked the night shift. Fewer people. Fewer chances for the kind of interaction that reminded him how invisible he'd become. The executives who worked here during the day barely registered his existence. If they noticed him at all, it was to step around his cart without breaking stride, phone calls uninterrupted, as if he were a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Tonight should have been no different. "Rodriguez, you incompetent bastard, I don't care what your contract says." The voice cut through the lobby's expensive silence like a chainsaw. Caleb's hand stilled on the mop handle. He recognized that voice. Everyone who worked in this building, from the basement to the penthouse, recognized that voice. Evelyn Hartman. She materialized from the executive elevators in a wave of designer perfume and barely contained fury. Mid-40s, blonde hair pulled into a severe bun that probably cost $200 to maintain, wearing a power suit that could have fed a family for a month. Behind her trailed a cluster of people speaking rapid-fire Spanish, their voices tight with frustration. "Ms. Hartman, if you would just review the translation clause." The man she'd called Rodriguez held up a tablet, his accent thick with desperation. "I've reviewed it. Your team signed off on terms you clearly didn't understand, and now you're trying to renegotiate after my company has already committed resources." Evelyn's heels clicked against marble like gunshots. "Do you know what that makes you? Liars or incompetents? Pick one." Caleb should have moved on, should have pushed his cart toward the West Wing and let whatever corporate drama was unfolding play out without him. But something in Rodriguez's expression stopped him. A kind of helpless anger Caleb knew too well. The rage of being dismissed in a language you couldn't fully command by someone who weaponized your limitations. He understood every word Rodriguez had said, every plea in the man's voice. And he understood what Evelyn had missed. Rodriguez wasn't trying to renegotiate. He was trying to explain that someone had deliberately mistranslated key clauses in their contract, embedding terms that would bankrupt his company. The fraud was elegant, sophisticated, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't speak both legal English and Castilian Spanish fluently enough to catch the subtle shifts in meaning. "Ms. Hartman, please." Rodriguez switched to Spanish, his frustration overwhelming his careful business English. "La cláusula de indemnización no dice lo que usted cree que dice. Alguien cambió." "English," Evelyn snapped. "We're in America. You want to do business here, you speak the language." The words landed like a slap. Caleb watched Rodriguez's face close down, watched the other Spanish-speaking executives exchange glances that spoke volumes. This deal, whatever it was, had just died. Not because of terms or money, but because of pride and power, and the kind of casual cruelty that people like Evelyn Hartman inflicted without even realizing it. Caleb started to turn away. That's when Evelyn noticed him. "You," her voice cracked across the lobby. "You speak English, don't you?" Every muscle in Caleb's body tensed. 20 years of survival instinct screamed at him to keep his head down, to respond with the expected deference and disappear as quickly as possible. But something else stirred beneath that instinct, something he'd buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it existed. "Yes, ma'am." His voice came out steady, neutral. "Then perhaps you can help our Spanish friends understand something." Evelyn's smile was all teeth, no warmth. She grabbed the mop from his hands, tossed it aside with a clatter that echoed through the lobby. "Translate this. When you sign a contract with Hartman Global, we expect you to honor it. No excuses, no cultural misunderstandings, no whining about translation errors. If you're too stupid to hire competent translators, that's your problem, not ours." The silence that followed was absolute. Rodriguez had gone pale. His colleagues looked away, embarrassment and anger warring on their faces. The security guards near the entrance shifted uncomfortably. Even Evelyn's own assistant, a sharp-eyed woman in her 20s, looked like she wanted to melt through the floor. And Caleb understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about business. This was about power, about reminding everyone in the room, especially the brown-skinned janitor whose mop she'd just thrown aside, exactly where they stood in her hierarchy. "I'm not a translator, ma'am." Caleb kept his voice even. "I'm maintenance staff." "Oh, I'm aware." Evelyn's laugh was bright and cruel. "But surely even you know enough Spanish to get my point across. What do they teach in those ESL classes? Buenos dias. ¿Dónde está el baño?" She turned to Rodriguez, her smile widening. "See? Even the janitor knows your language better than you know ours." The insult was designed to cut two ways: to diminish Rodriguez by comparing him to a janitor, to diminish Caleb by making his existence the baseline for incompetence. It worked. Caleb saw Rodriguez's shoulders sag, saw the resignation settle over the man's face like frost. Whatever fight had been in him died right there, crushed under the weight of public humiliation in a language he couldn't quite master, in a building where power spoke English and nothing else. "Pick up your mop," Evelyn said to Caleb, already turning away, "and maybe clean up this mess while you're at it." She gestured at the marble floor where Rodriguez had dropped some papers. "That's what we pay you for, isn't it? Cleaning up after people?" Caleb bent down, but he didn't pick up the mop first. He picked up the papers. And as he did, his eyes caught on the contract terms printed there. He saw it immediately, the clause Rodriguez had been trying to explain. The mistranslation was subtle, almost invisible, but it inverted the entire liability structure. In English, it appeared Hartman Global would be protected. In the Spanish version, it made Rodriguez's company responsible for damages they'd never agreed to accept. Someone had sabotaged this deal. Someone who knew both languages well enough to hide fraud in translation. "Sometime today," Evelyn called over her shoulder, not even looking back. Caleb's hands tightened on the papers. He should hand them over. Should go back to his cart and his mop and his carefully maintained invisibility. Should remember that people like him didn't speak up in rooms like this, to women like her, about things that weren't their concern. But when he looked up, he caught Rodriguez's eyes. The man wasn't looking at him with the contempt Evelyn had. He was looking at him like a drowning man looks at a passing ship, with desperate, fading hope. "The contract," Caleb heard himself say. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the vast lobby. "There's a problem with the translation." Evelyn stopped walking. The sound of her heels went silent. "Excuse me?" She turned slowly, her expression somewhere between disbelief and rage. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. Every survival instinct he'd ever developed screamed at him to backtrack, to apologize, to remember his place. But he'd spent 20 years being invisible, 20 years swallowing his intelligence, his education, his worth. Because the world had taught him that people who looked like him, who worked jobs like his, didn't get to have those things. And he was so goddamn tired of it. "The indemnity clause," he continued, keeping his eyes on the papers in his hands rather than on Evelyn's face. "Clause 7, subsection 3. The English version says Hartman Global assumes liability for regulatory compliance failures. But the Spanish version inverts it. It makes the subcontractor responsible. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud. The lobby had gone so quiet that Caleb could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant ping of an elevator, the rustle of papers as Rodriguez snatched them from his hands. The Spanish executive's eyes raced across the text. His lips moved silently, checking translation against translation. And then his face changed, shock giving way to fury, giving way to something harder and colder. Hijo de puta, Rodriguez breathed. He looked up at his colleagues, switching to rapid Spanish. He's right. Look at this. Look at what they tried to... Nobody tried anything, Evelyn cut in, her voice dangerously level. She crossed the lobby in 3 sharp strides, heels clicking like a countdown. Who the hell do you think you are? She was talking to Caleb. Up close, he could see the perfect makeup, the subtle work that kept her face unnaturally smooth, the diamond earrings that probably cost more than his annual salary. He could also see something else, a flicker of genuine surprise beneath the anger. She'd expected him to cower, to apologize, to disappear back into the comfortable invisibility where people like him belonged. I'm maintenance staff, ma'am, Caleb said quietly, but I can read both languages. You can... Evelyn's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. You expect me to believe that my janitor is fluent in Spanish? What? Did you pick it up from telenovelas? The casual racism in her dismissal was almost impressive in its efficiency. Not overt enough to be actionable, but clear enough to remind everyone present that she didn't consider him capable of legitimate linguistic skill. Rodriguez, however, was no longer paying attention to Evelyn. He was on his phone, barking orders in Spanish to someone on the other end. His colleagues had gathered around the contract, pointing at clauses, their voices rising in anger as they confirmed what Caleb had spotted. Ms. Hartman. Rodriguez ended his call and turned to face her, his earlier nervousness replaced by cold fury. My legal team is reviewing this now. If what your employee has identified is accurate, and I believe it is, then this contract was fraudulent from its inception. We will not be signing anything tonight. In fact, we will be consulting with American legal counsel about potential criminal charges. The blood drained from Evelyn's face. Criminal charges? Are you insane? This is a simple translation error. There is nothing simple about this. Rodriguez's English had suddenly become crystal clear, his accent sharpening each word like a blade. And I think you know that. My company has invested 18 months and $40 million in this partnership based on terms we were promised. If your organization deliberately mistranslated, we didn't mistranslate anything, Evelyn snapped. But there was something uncertain in her voice now, something that suggested she wasn't entirely sure what her own legal team had done. Our translators are top-tier professionals. If there's an error, it was unintentional, and we can certainly fix it? Rodriguez's smile was cold. Renegotiate? After you just finished calling us incompetent liars for trying to do exactly that. He gathered up the contracts, his colleagues flanking him like soldiers. I think not. We're done here. They walked away. Just like that. 18 months of negotiations. A partnership that was supposed to expand Hartman Global into Latin American markets. Billions of dollars in projected revenue. Gone. The lobby felt cavernous in their absence. Evelyn stood frozen, her perfect posture finally cracking. Caleb watched her process what had just happened, watched her mind race through implications and consequences. He should have felt satisfaction, maybe even vindication. Instead, he just felt tired. You, Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. You just cost me the biggest deal of the quarter. No, ma'am. Caleb bent down and picked up his mop. Someone who committed fraud cost you the deal. I just pointed it out. You don't get to make that distinction. She was shaking now, fury and shock warring for control. You're a goddamn janitor. You clean floors, you empty trash. You do not interfere in corporate negotiations worth more money than you'll see in 10 lifetimes. Do you understand me? Caleb met her eyes. Really met them. For the first time since she'd noticed his existence. I understand that you'd rather lose billions than admit a janitor might know something you don't. The slap came fast. Not literally. Evelyn Hartman was too smart for that, too aware of cameras and witnesses. But the words that followed were designed to hit just as hard. "You're fired," she said, "effective immediately. Security will escort you out. And I promise you, you will never work in a professional building in this city again. I'll make sure of it. Whatever pathetic little life you've built here, it's over." She turned to her assistant. "Get me legal. Get me Rodriguez's team, and get me whoever the hell hired that man." Then she was gone, disappearing into the executive elevator without another glance back. Caleb stood alone in the lobby, still holding his mop, water dripping onto imported marble. The security guard who approached looked uncomfortable. "Hey man, I'm sorry. You got to—" "I know." Caleb set down the mop with care, muscle memory guiding his hands through the familiar motion. He'd done this hundreds of times before. Thousands, maybe. But this was the last time. "I need to get my things from the break room. I'll walk with you." They moved through the building in silence, past offices where cleaners were still working, their faces carefully neutral as they pretended not to notice Caleb being escorted out. Past conference rooms with glass walls that revealed empty chairs arranged around expensive tables. Past everything he'd spent 5 years moving through invisibly, understanding more than anyone knew, saying nothing. Until tonight. His locker held almost nothing. A change of clothes, a battered paperback in French, his mother's photo from better days. He packed them into a backpack that had seen better years, aware of the guard's patient presence behind him. "For what it's worth," the guard said as they headed toward the exit, "I think you did the right thing." Caleb didn't respond. Right and wrong didn't pay rent, didn't cover his mother's medication, didn't change the fact that he'd just destroyed his own life to point out a fraud that would probably cost him everything and change nothing for anyone else. The night air hit him like a baptism when they stepped outside, cool and damp, carrying the smell of rain. The city stretched around him, indifferent to his small disaster. Somewhere up in that tower, Evelyn Hartman was probably already on the phone, smoothing over the damage, rewriting the narrative so that a janitor's interference became an unfortunate incident rather than a revelation about her company's practices. And Rodriguez? He'd probably go back to Mexico or Spain or wherever he'd come from, his own career damaged by a failed deal, unlikely to ever know that the man who'd saved him from a fraudulent contract had lost everything in the process. That was how the world worked. Caleb had known it his whole life. But as he walked away from Hartman Global Industries, backpack slung over one shoulder, something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not vindication. Something quieter and more dangerous. The knowledge that for once, just once, he'd refused to be invisible. His phone buzzed. Probably his supervisor, already informed of his termination, already writing him out of the schedule. Caleb pulled it out, ready to delete whatever corporate efficiency had generated. But the message wasn't from his supervisor. It was from a number he didn't recognize. And it was in Spanish. "You were right about the contract. Meet me tomorrow. I have a proposition. AR. Antonio Rodriguez." Caleb stared at the message for a long moment, standing on a darkening street corner while the city moved around him. He should delete it. Should recognize it for what it probably was. Pity from a businessman who felt guilty that his deal's collapse had collateral damage. But underneath the exhaustion and the shock of losing his job, that dangerous thing in his chest flickered again. Curiosity. Or maybe something more reckless. He typed back, "Where and when?" The response came immediately. "Café Berlitz. Noon. Don't be late." Caleb pocketed his phone and started walking. He had nowhere to be now. No job to rest up for. No schedule to maintain. For the first time in years, his future was completely uncertain. Somehow, that felt almost like freedom. The subway home was nearly empty. Caleb found a seat in the corner and let the rhythm of the rails wash over him. His reflection stared back from the dark window. Same face, same uniform, same invisibility. But something had shifted. Some internal calibration that had kept him silent and safe for so long had finally broken. He thought about Evelyn Hartman's face when Rodriguez walked away. The shock. The fury. The complete inability to process that her dismissal of a janitor had cost her an empire-building deal. People like her moved through the world believing their perceptions were reality. That if they didn't see worth in someone, it didn't exist. What happened when that certainty cracked? His phone buzzed again. This time it was his supervisor. Heard what happened. Sorry, man, that's rough. You need a reference for the next gig. I'll vouch for you. Caleb appreciated the gesture, even if they both knew it wouldn't help. Evelyn's threat wasn't empty. She had the connections to make sure he stayed blacklisted from every major building in the city. He'd be lucky to get work cleaning gas stations after this. Another message. Hey, it's Marcus from third floor. Everyone's talking about what you did. That took guts. Also, you really speak Spanish? That's wild, man. And another. This is Yolanda. I was in the lobby when it happened. Ms. Hartman had no right to talk to you like that or that businessman. Good for you for speaking up. We're all proud of you down here. Caleb blinked at his phone. He'd worked in that building for 5 years, and he couldn't remember the last time any of his coworkers had texted him about anything more substantial than shift swaps. Now his phone was lighting up with messages from people he barely knew, people who'd been just as invisible as he was, suddenly finding their voices to reach out. It was strange, unsettling, almost overwhelming. The subway lurched to his stop. Caleb climbed the stairs to street level and walked the 6 blocks to his apartment, a studio in a building that had been up and coming for 30 years and never quite arrived. The hallway smelled like cooking oil and old carpet. His door stuck in its frame the way it always did, requiring a specific shoulder bump to open. Inside was the life he'd built from scraps and silence. A futon that doubled as couch and bed. A kitchenette barely large enough for one person. Bookshelves made from cinder blocks and stolen planks, every inch crammed with dictionaries, grammar guides, novels in 6 languages. A small desk where his mother's medical bills were stacked in careful piles, organized by due date and likelihood of payment. This was what he stood to lose if Rodriguez's proposition was just rich guy pity, if there was no real job offer at the end of whatever meeting he'd agreed to attend. Caleb dropped his backpack and sank onto the futon. The ceiling had a water stain that looked like South America if you squinted. He'd spent a lot of time staring at that stain over the years, imagining all the places those languages in his head could take him if he'd been born into a different life. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the messages still coming in. His coworkers were organizing some kind of collection to help with his lost wages. Someone had started a group chat about unionizing the cleaning staff. Marcus had sent a meme about corporate karma with the caption, "She didn't know who she was messing with." But underneath the support, Caleb could sense the undercurrent. Shock that the quiet guy who never caused trouble had suddenly caused the biggest trouble imaginable. By tomorrow, half of them would be wondering if they should have stayed away from him, kept their heads down, avoided association with someone who'd been fired for speaking out of turn. That was how it always worked. Momentary solidarity followed by self-preservation. His phone rang. An unknown number, but local area code. Hello? Mr. Moore? The voice was male, professional, with an accent Caleb immediately placed as German. My name is Klaus Bergmann. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Rodriguez regarding tomorrow's meeting. Caleb sat up straighter. I didn't give him my full name. No, but you did speak up in a very public lobby. Security footage is remarkably thorough these days. There was something amused in the man's tone. Mr. Rodriguez wanted me to confirm the meeting and provide additional information. Do you have a moment? I have nothing but moments now. Yes, I heard about your termination. Unfortunate, but perhaps fortuitous. Papers rustled on the other end of the line. Mr. Rodriguez was very impressed by your linguistic capabilities. He asked me to do some research into your background. Caleb's stomach tightened. That's invasive. It's due diligence. We found your academic records from before you dropped out of university. Full scholarship to study linguistics at Columbia. Perfect grades for 2 years. Then you disappeared from the program. A pause. Your mother's cancer diagnosis came 6 months before you left school. The old grief stirred, familiar as breathing. She needed someone to take care of her. Insurance didn't cover half of what the treatments cost. So you left one of the most prestigious linguistics programs in the country to work minimum wage jobs and teach yourself languages from library books. Bergman's voice had shifted, losing its professional neutrality. Mr. Moore, do you have any idea how extraordinary that is? It's desperate, not extraordinary. Perhaps both. More papers rustling. Mr. Rodriguez's company has been expanding into North American markets. The deal with Hartman Global was supposed to be the cornerstone of that expansion. Now we find ourselves in a difficult position. We need American partnerships, but we need partners who won't try to cheat us with mistranslated contracts. That's not my problem anymore, isn't it? You identified the fraud. You understood both the legal English and the technical Spanish well enough to spot a sophisticated deception. And from what we observed, you did it in seconds while standing in a public lobby being humiliated. Bergman paused for effect. Mr. Rodriguez wants to offer you a position with his company, corporate translator and cultural liaison. You'd be responsible for ensuring our American partnerships are built on accurate communication and good faith negotiation. Caleb's mouth had gone dry. I was fired 2 hours ago. Why would you trust me? Because you spoke up when you had everything to lose and nothing to gain. That's the kind of integrity most corporations pay consultants millions to fake. Bergman's voice warmed with something like approval. The salary would be substantial. The position would be based in New York, with travel as needed. You'd have full benefits, including health coverage comprehensive enough for ongoing medical care. The mention of health coverage hit Caleb like a punch. His mother had been dead for 3 years, but the medical debt she'd left behind was still crushing him. And the fear of ever needing that kind of care himself, of ending up in the same impossible situation. What's the catch? The catch is that tomorrow's meeting isn't just coffee. Mr. Rodriguez wants you to start immediately. We have another negotiation scheduled in 2 days with a different American firm. He wants you there, ensuring no one tries to pull the same fraud. Bergman's tone sharpened. And there's one more thing. Evelyn Hartman will almost certainly be at that negotiation. Of course she would. The corporate world was smaller than people thought, especially at the level where billions changed hands. Why would Rodriguez work with Hartman Global again after what happened? He wouldn't. But Hartman is the minority stakeholder in the company we're actually negotiating with, Winchester Technologies. It's a complicated structure, but the short version is that we can't avoid her if we want the Winchester deal. Bergman paused. Mr. Rodriguez thought you should know before you agree to anything. Walking into a room where Evelyn Hartman is present, in a professional capacity, less than 48 hours after she fired you, it could be uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. That was corporate speak for potentially humiliating, possibly career-destroying, definitely awkward. But underneath the anxiety, that dangerous thing in Caleb's chest flickered again, the image of Evelyn's face when Rodriguez walked away, the shock of having her certainty cracked. The realization that the man she'd dismissed as invisible knew things she didn't, saw things she'd missed, mattered in ways she couldn't understand. What would her face look like when he walked into that boardroom? Mr. Moore, are you still there? I'm here. Caleb took a breath. Tell Mr. Rodriguez I'll be at the cafe tomorrow, noon. I want to hear more. Excellent. I'll let him know. Bergman hesitated. For what it's worth, I've been in international business for 25 years. I've seen a lot of translators, a lot of linguists, a lot of people who claim cultural expertise. What you did in that lobby, that wasn't just language skills. That was understanding. Real understanding of how words carry power, how translation can be weaponized, how communication breaks down. That's rare. Very rare. Or I just got lucky. No, Mr. Moore, you got educated. There's a difference. The line went dead. Caleb set down his phone and stared at that water stain on his ceiling. 48 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether he could pick up extra shifts to cover his share of the building's new heating costs. Now he was contemplating walking into a high-stakes corporate negotiation, employed by a man he'd met for 30 seconds, to face down a woman who'd promised to destroy his career. It was insane. It was reckless. It was the first interesting thing that had happened to him in years. He pulled out his laptop, an ancient thing held together with electrical tape and hope, and started researching. Winchester Technologies. Rodriguez's company, which he now learned was called Vanguard International. The deal that had collapsed in the Hartman lobby. The players involved. The more he read, the more complex it became. This wasn't just about translation. It was about power, about markets, about the invisible structures that determined who got to build empires and who got crushed beneath them. And somehow, impossibly, he'd stumbled into the middle of it. Or maybe he'd always been in the middle of it. Maybe that's what invisibility was. standing in the center of everything important, seeing it all clearly, while the people with power assumed you were looking at nothing. Caleb worked through the night, building a framework of understanding. By the time pale light started seeping through his window, he had pages of notes, diagrams showing corporate relationships, translations of key documents he'd found in public filings. His eyes burned, his back ached from hunching over the laptop, but his mind was alive in a way it hadn't been since he'd left Columbia. He showered in the tiny bathroom where the tiles were cracked and the water pressure was a joke. Put on the only professional clothes he owned, a button-down shirt that was 5 years out of style and pants he'd bought from a thrift store. Looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who'd spent a decade learning to disappear. Time to find out if he remembered how to be visible. The cafe was in Midtown, the kind of place where business people met to pretend they were being casual while negotiating things that would affect thousands of lives. Caleb arrived 15 minutes early and ordered a coffee he couldn't really afford, then settled into a corner booth where he could watch the door. Rodriguez walked in at exactly noon. He looked different in daylight, older maybe, or just more tired, but his eyes were sharp when they found Caleb, and his handshake was firm. "Mr. Moore, thank you for coming." "Mr. Rodriguez," Caleb gestured to the seat across from him. "I have questions." "I would be disappointed if you didn't." Rodriguez ordered an espresso from a passing waiter, then leaned back and studied Caleb with unconcealed interest. "So, ask, why me? You could hire professional translators with credentials, experience, people who won't bring the baggage of being publicly fired from a building you're trying to do business in." "I could," Rodriguez smiled. "I have actually. I employ 7 translators across 4 languages, all very professional, all very credentialed, and not one of them spotted the fraud in that contract." "Maybe they weren't looking for it." "Exactly." Rodriguez leaned forward. "They were looking at words. You were looking at intent. You understood that translation isn't just about converting language. It's about preserving meaning across cultural contexts. That's a different skill entirely." The waiter brought Rodriguez's espresso. He took a sip, grimaced at the temperature, set it aside. "I've spent 18 months trying to break into American markets," he continued. "Every negotiation has been a minefield. Not because the business is complicated, but because the communication is. Americans negotiate directly. They say what they mean, mostly. In my culture, directness can be insulting. We build relationships first, trust second, business third. Your culture does it backward. And that creates gaps. Gaps where people like Evelyn Hartman hide fraud." Caleb thought about the lobby, about Evelyn's casual cruelty, her absolute certainty that she was right, and everyone else was either lying or incompetent. "She didn't know about the mistranslation." Rodriguez's eyebrows rose. "You're sure?" Her reaction was wrong. If she'd known, she would have covered better. What I saw was someone who delegated to lawyers she trusted, who genuinely believed the other side was trying to cheat her. Caleb paused. "She's guilty of arrogance, not fraud." That's a generous interpretation from someone she just destroyed. It's an accurate one. If you want me working for you, you need to know I'll tell you truth, not what you want to hear. Whoa, Rodriguez studied him for a long moment, then smiled. A real smile this time, reaching his eyes. "Klaus was right about you. You're either very brave or very stupid." "Maybe both." "Definitely both." Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. "Here's what I'm offering. 6-month contract to start. Renewable if things work out. Your job is to be in every major negotiation, reading not just the words but the subtext. You tell me when communication is breaking down. You catch the cultural gaps before they become chasms. You make sure no one is hiding fraud in translation, whether they work for me or against me." Caleb scrolled through the contract. The salary made his breath catch. More than he'd made in the last 3 years combined. Health insurance that actually covered things. A signing bonus that would clear his medical debt. "This is too much." "It's appropriate for someone with your skills. If you'd finished your degree at Columbia, you'd be earning twice that." Rodriguez took another sip of cooling espresso. "I need you to understand something, Mr. Moore. This isn't charity. This isn't guilt over you losing your job. This is me recognizing rare talent when I see it and moving quickly before someone else does." "Evelyn blacklisted me." Evelyn runs Hartman Global, not the entire corporate world. And frankly, after what happened last night, her credibility is currently in question. Rodriguez's smile turned sharp. You embarrassed her. In public. In front of investors. That kind of thing travels fast in our circles. By this time tomorrow, everyone will know that her company tried to push through a fraudulent contract and got caught by a janitor. That's not a story she can control. Caleb hadn't thought about it that way. Hadn't considered that his moment of speaking up might have ripples beyond his own immediate disaster. The Winchester negotiation, he said. Klaus mentioned it would be uncomfortable. It will be. Rodriguez didn't sugarcoat it. Evelyn will be there. She'll probably try to have you removed from the room. She might succeed. But I want you there anyway, because Winchester has worked with Hartman before, and I want to know if there are any hidden problems in their proposal. You're using me as a weapon against her. I'm using you as protection against everyone, including her. Rodriguez met his eyes steadily. You want the unvarnished truth? You scare her. You represent something she can't control. Intelligence she didn't recognize, ability she didn't value, power she didn't see coming. That makes you useful. But it also makes you dangerous to her and potentially to yourself. This job comes with risk. Caleb looked down at the contract on the tablet, at the numbers that could change his life, at the opportunity to finally use the education he'd buried, the skills he'd hidden, the understanding he'd accumulated in silence. When do I start? Rodriguez's smile was pure satisfaction. Right now. Winchester meeting is tomorrow at 2. We have 24 hours to prepare you for the most important negotiation of my career and possibly the worst day of yours. He raised his espresso and mock toast. Welcome to Vanguard International, Mr. Moore. Try not to get fired on your first day. The 24 hours between signing the contract and walking into the Winchester negotiation felt like falling and flying at the same time. Rodriguez hadn't been exaggerating about preparation. Within an hour of leaving the cafe, Caleb found himself in a midtown office suite that Vanguard International had rented for the week, surrounded by contracts, financial statements, and 3 other people who looked at him like he was either a miracle or a mistake they hadn't identified yet. Klaus Bergman turned out to be a bear of a man in his 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of accent that made every statement sound like it had been carved from granite. So, you're the janitor, he said, not unkindly. Rodriguez thinks you walk on water. Let's see if he's right. The other 2 were younger. Sarah Chen, a corporate attorney with sharp eyes and sharper questions, who spent the first 20 minutes testing Caleb's Spanish with increasingly complex legal terminology. And Marcus Webb, a financial analyst who looked barely old enough to drink, but spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen empires rise and fall in spreadsheet columns. Here's what you need to understand, Sarah said, spreading documents across the conference table like tarot cards predicting disaster. Winchester Technologies manufactures semiconductors. Critical components for everything from phones to military equipment. They want to expand into Latin American markets, but they lack the infrastructure. Rodriguez's company has the distribution networks, the regulatory relationships, the local expertise. It's a perfect partnership. Except for Hartman, Marcus added, pulling up a financial diagram on his laptop. She owns 18% of Winchester through a shell corporation. Not enough to control the company, but enough to kill any deals she doesn't like. And after last night, she definitely doesn't like Rodriguez. Caleb studied the ownership structure, tracing the lines of power and money. Why does Winchester need Rodriguez if Hartman's involved? She has her own Latin American contacts. Had, Klaus corrected, past tense. After that contract debacle became public, 3 of her major international partners pulled out. The fraud investigation is preliminary, but the damage to her reputation is immediate. She needs Winchester more than Winchester needs her right now. Which means she's desperate, Sarah said, and desperate people do unpredictable things. They worked through the night, building Caleb's understanding of the deal structure, the players, the stakes. He absorbed it all with the same intensity he'd once applied to learning Mandarin from a library book's worth of characters, Russian from radio broadcasts, French from stolen moments in used bookstores. This was just another language, the language of corporate power, spoken in percentages and leverage points, and carefully worded clauses that meant everything and nothing. Around 3 in the morning, Rodriguez appeared with coffee and food from an all-night deli. He'd changed into casual clothes, looking more human than he had in the cafe. "How's he doing?" he asked Klaus. "He's a sponge, absorbs everything. Whether he can apply it under pressure remains to be seen." "I'm sitting right here," Caleb said, not looking up from the Winchester financial statements he was annotating in 3 languages. Rodriguez laughed. "Good. I was worried you might be too polite." He pulled up a chair next to Caleb. "Let me tell you what's really going to happen tomorrow. Winchester's CEO is a man named Richard Ashford. British, educated at Oxford, thinks Americans are crude and Latin Americans are worse. He'll speak to you in Spanish just to show off that he can. Don't be impressed." "I won't." Evelyn will try to dominate the room. She always does. Her strategy is to make everyone else feel small so she looks bigger. You've seen it firsthand. Rodriguez paused, something complicated crossing his face. When you walk in tomorrow, she's going to react. Probably badly. Don't let it throw you. "I won't," Caleb repeated, though his stomach tightened at the thought. "Yes, you will. Because you're human, and she humiliated you, and no amount of preparation makes that easy to face." Rodriguez's voice gentled. "But here's what I need you to remember. You'll be in that room because you earned it, not because of charity, not because of guilt, but because you have skills that are valuable. Don't let her take that away from you." Caleb met his eyes. "Why does this matter so much to you?" "The deal, yes, but why does it matter that I'm the one helping with it?" Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "When I was 23, I was cleaning hotel rooms in Madrid. I had an engineering degree, top of my class, but my family had no connections, no money, no way to open doors. So I cleaned rooms and listened to business travelers talk about deals I understood better than they did. For 5 years, I was invisible." His smile was sad. "Then one day, a guest left behind contract documents. I saw an error that would have cost his company millions. I corrected it, left a note, thought nothing of it. Turns out he was a very important man. He tracked me down, asked me who I was, why I was cleaning toilets with an engineering degree, and he gave me a chance." "That's a nice story," Caleb said carefully. "It's a true one. And it taught me that the world is full of brilliant people trapped in the wrong positions because no one bothered to look at them closely enough." Rodriguez stood, stretching. "So when I see a janitor who can spot sophisticated fraud in seconds, who speaks multiple languages he taught himself from books, who has the courage to speak up when it costs him everything, I look closely. And I don't let that talent go to waste." After Rodriguez left, Caleb sat alone in the conference room, surrounded by documents and cold coffee, thinking about invisibility and chance and the razor-thin line between the two. By the time dawn broke over Manhattan, he'd memorized every relevant detail of the Winchester deal, identified 3 potential problem areas in the proposed contract language, and constructed a mental map of the power dynamics he was about to walk into. His eyes burned, his head ached, but his mind was clear. Sarah appeared at 7 with fresh coffee and a suit. Rodriguez's assistant guessed your size, try it on. The suit fit perfectly, better than anything Caleb had ever worn. Dark charcoal, subtle pinstripes, expensive enough that he was afraid to move too quickly in it. When he looked in the bathroom mirror, he barely recognized himself. He looked like someone who belonged in boardrooms, someone who mattered. The illusion was dangerous. He knew that, but he let himself believe it anyway, just for a moment. "You clean up well," Marcus said when Caleb emerged. "Though you might want to eat something. You look like you're about to pass out." They fed him breakfast from the deli. Klaus drilled him on key phrases in the contracts. Sarah ran through potential scenarios, playing devil's advocate with brutal efficiency. And through it all, Caleb felt something building in his chest. Not quite confidence, but something harder and colder. The determination of someone who'd been underestimated his entire life and was finally getting a chance to prove everyone wrong. At 1:30, they climbed into a town car. Rodriguez was already inside, looking polished and dangerous in a 3-piece suit. "Ready?" "No," Caleb said honestly. "Good. If you felt ready, I'd be worried you didn't understand the stakes." Rodriguez smiled, but his eyes were serious. "Remember, you're not there to confront Evelyn. You're there to do a job. The rest is just noise." The Winchester Technologies building was in the financial district, all glass and steel reaching toward an indifferent sky. They cleared security, rode an elevator that moved so smoothly Caleb couldn't tell they were moving, stepped into a reception area that screamed money and power in a dozen subtle ways. And there, across the marble floor, stood Evelyn Hartman. She saw them immediately. Caleb watched the recognition hit her face like a physical blow. Shock giving way to fury, giving way to something colder and more calculated. She was talking to a tall man with silver hair who had to be Richard Ashford, but her attention had completely left the conversation. "Mr. Rodriguez," she called out, her voice carrying across the space with practiced projection. "How unexpected to see you here." "Ms. Hartman." Rodriguez's smile was polite and empty. "I was invited, along with my team." He gestured to the group. "You remember Klaus Bergman, my chief strategist, Sarah Chen, legal counsel, and this is Caleb Moore, my senior translator and cultural liaison." The silence that followed could have cut diamonds. Evelyn stared at Caleb like he was a ghost that had materialized in her boardroom. "You can't be serious." "I'm always serious about business, Ms. Hartman." Rodriguez's voice remained pleasant, but steel ran underneath. "Mr. Moore is a valuable member of my team. His expertise in cross-cultural communication has already proven invaluable." "His expertise?" Evelyn's laugh was sharp and ugly. "He's a janitor, or he was, until he got himself fired for interfering in matters he didn't understand." "He understood them better than your legal team did," Klaus said mildly. "That's why we're here, and your deal isn't." Ashford had been watching this exchange with the fascinated attention of someone observing a car accident in progress. "Perhaps we should move to the conference room," he suggested, his British accent making the suggestion sound like a royal decree. "I'm sure we can resolve any personnel concerns once we're seated." "There's nothing to resolve," Evelyn said, but she was looking at Rodriguez now, not Caleb. "If he's in the room, I'm not negotiating." "Then don't negotiate." Rodriguez's voice stayed level, but Caleb could sense the anger beneath it. "Winchester invited both our companies here because they recognize the value of this partnership. If you want to walk away over a personnel choice that has nothing to do with you, that's your decision. But I think Mr. Ashford would prefer to proceed with the people both parties have selected for their teams." Ashford's eyes moved between them, calculating. "Ms. Hartman, perhaps nothing." He interfered in confidential business negotiations. He cost Hartman Global a major international partnership, and now you're telling me I have to sit across from him and pretend he's a legitimate professional? Evelyn's composure was cracking, fury bleeding through the corporate polish. "I won't do it." "Then you're welcome to leave," a new voice said. Everyone turned. A woman had appeared from the conference room, mid-60s, steel-gray hair cut in a precise bob, wearing a suit that made Evelyn's look cheap by comparison. She looked at the assembled group with the mild interest of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Margaret Winchester," she continued. "I own 68% of this company, which means I decide who sits at my table. And I've reviewed Mr. Moore's credentials. Columbia University, full academic scholarship, nearly perfect academic record before personal circumstances required him to leave. Multiple languages acquired through independent study. And most recently, the identification of contract fraud that saved Mr. Rodriguez's company from a devastating legal and financial trap." Her smile was thin. "He sounds eminently qualified to me." Evelyn had gone pale. "Mrs. Winchester, I didn't realize you'd be attending this meeting personally." "I wasn't planning to. But when I heard about the drama from last night, I became curious." Margaret Winchester's gaze moved to Caleb with sharp intelligence. "Mr. Moore, I understand you spotted the mistranslation in under a minute while being publicly humiliated. That's either extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck. Which was it?" Every eye in the reception area locked on Caleb. His mouth had gone dry. This was it. The moment where he either proved he belonged or confirmed Evelyn's dismissal of him as an imposter. "Skill," he said quietly. The translation error was in the legal definition of liability versus responsibility. English treats them as near synonyms in casual use, but in Spanish legal terminology, responsabilidad implies moral and legal obligation, while deuda implies financial debt without moral weight. The mistranslation inverted the liability structure by substituting one for the other in a way that looked correct to anyone not specifically trained in both legal systems. The silence that followed felt different. Margaret Winchester's eyebrows had risen. Ashford looked impressed despite himself. Even Klaus was nodding with what might have been approval. "You learned that from library books," Evelyn said flatly. "It wasn't quite a question. I learned it from studying both languages at a graduate level while working nights to pay for my mother's cancer treatment," Caleb corrected, the words coming out harder than he'd intended. "I learned it from listening to lawyers argue cases in 3 languages while I emptied their trash cans. I learned it because I had to, because education isn't something you stop doing just because you can't afford to sit in a classroom anymore." The air felt charged, electric. Caleb could feel Rodriguez's approval, Sarah's surprise, Klaus's satisfaction. He could also feel Evelyn's rage, barely contained behind her professional mask. "Mr. Moore," Margaret Winchester said, "would you mind translating something for me?" Off the cuff, no preparation. She pulled out her phone, scrolled for a moment, then read, "Los acuerdos comerciales trascienden las meras transacciones financieras. Representan compromisos éticos entre entidades que deben mantener la integridad incluso cuando los beneficios inmediatos sugieren lo contrario." Caleb translated without hesitation. "Commercial agreements transcend mere financial transactions. They represent ethical commitments between entities that must maintain integrity even when immediate profits suggest otherwise." He paused. Though "suggest otherwise" doesn't quite capture the Spanish. A more precise translation would be, even when immediate profits argue for abandoning those principles. The verb sugerir is weaker than the implied meaning. Margaret Winchester smiled. It transformed her face, making her look years younger. "Fascinating and correct. I wrote that phrase specifically to test whether someone would prioritize literal accuracy over contextual meaning. Most professional translators give me the literal version." She looked at Evelyn. "Ms. Hartman, I believe your concerns about Mr. Moore's qualifications have been addressed. Shall we proceed to the conference room?" It wasn't a question. It was a command delivered with the absolute authority of someone who owned the building they stood in and most of the block it occupied. Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Of course. They filed into the conference room, a cathedral of glass and mahogany with a view of the harbor that probably cost more per square foot than Caleb's entire apartment. The table could have seated 20. Today, it would hold 8. Caleb found himself positioned directly across from Evelyn. Close enough to see the fury in her eyes. Close enough to watch her hands clench and unclench on the table's polished surface. Close enough to hear her breathing, faster than it should be, betraying the emotions her face tried to hide. "Let's begin," Margaret Winchester said, taking the head of the table. Ashford sat to her right, looking like a man who'd just realized he wasn't the most powerful person in the room. Rodriguez took the opposite end, flanked by Klaus and Sarah, which left Caleb, Evelyn, and 2 Winchester executives filling the sides. "The proposed partnership is straightforward," Margaret continued. "Winchester Technologies manufactures components. Vanguard International has distribution networks throughout Latin America and established relationships with governments and corporations we've been unable to reach. Together, we could dominate emerging markets in semiconductors for the next decade. The question," Ashford added, "is whether both parties can work together productively, given recent tensions." "There are no tensions on our end," Rodriguez said smoothly. "Vanguard is prepared to move forward with full transparency and good faith negotiation. We've even brought additional expertise to ensure that all communications are crystal clear." He nodded toward Caleb. "Mr. Moore will be reviewing all contract language in real time, flagging any potential misunderstandings before they become problems." "That won't be necessary," Evelyn said quickly. "Winchester has its own legal team. We don't need outside—" "I think it's an excellent idea," Margaret interrupted. "Given what happened with your previous negotiation, Mr. Rodriguez, I appreciate the caution. And frankly, Ms. Hartman, after reviewing the contract that fell apart so spectacularly, I have some concerns about the thoroughness of your legal reviews." The rebuke was delivered gently, but it landed like a bomb. Evelyn's face flushed. "That situation was unfortunate, but it was fraudulent," Klaus said bluntly. Someone on your legal team deliberately mistranslated key terms to disadvantage the other party. Whether you knew about it or not, it reflected catastrophically on Hartman Global's integrity. We're investigating internally, Evelyn said through gritted teeth. The individuals responsible will be held accountable. I'm sure they will be, Margaret said, in a tone that suggested she wasn't sure at all. In the meantime, let's discuss the actual terms of our partnership. Mr. Ashford has prepared a preliminary framework. For the next 2 hours, they negotiated. Caleb listened with complete focus, tracking 3 conversations simultaneously, the English being spoken, the subtext being implied, and the potential translations that would eventually carry these terms into Spanish-speaking markets. He made notes, asked questions, pointed out places where terminology could be interpreted multiple ways. And through it all, he felt Evelyn's eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to fail. The first crack came during a discussion of liability clauses. Ashford proposed language that seemed straightforward in English, but would create massive problems in Spanish-speaking legal frameworks. Caleb caught it immediately. That won't work, he said, speaking up for the first time in 20 minutes. Everyone looked at him. Rodriguez nodded encouragingly. Margaret Winchester leaned forward with interest. Why not? Ashford asked, sounding more curious than defensive. The phrase reasonable care has specific legal meaning in American tort law, but when translated to Spanish as cuidado razonable, it becomes subjective. Different Latin American countries define reasonableness differently. Mexico uses a preponderance standard. Argentina requires clear and convincing evidence. Chile has a good faith interpretation standard. If this clause goes into effect across all those jurisdictions, you'll spend years in litigation arguing over what reasonable means. So what do you suggest? Margaret asked. Caleb pulled out his tablet where he'd been drafting alternatives. Define specific benchmarks instead of relying on subjective standards. List the actual safety measures, compliance requirements, and documentation procedures that constitute adequate care. Make it objective rather than interpretive. Sarah was already typing, converting his explanation into contract language. Klaus was nodding. Rodriguez looked satisfied, and Evelyn looked like she wanted to explode. This is absurd, she finally said. We're letting a janitor rewrite international contract law? We're letting a trained linguist with expertise in cross-cultural legal terminology provide valuable input, Margaret corrected, her voice cooling several degrees. Something your team apparently failed to do, which is why your last negotiation collapsed. My team cost you millions of dollars and significant reputational damage. Margaret's patience had clearly worn thin. Ms. Hartman, I value your company's partnership with Winchester, but I value competence more. And right now, Mr. Moore is demonstrating more practical expertise than anyone in this room, including you. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Evelyn's hands were shaking. Caleb could see her fighting for control, could see the moment she realized that arguing further would only make things worse. Of course, she said finally, her voice brittle. I simply want to ensure we're maintaining appropriate professional standards. As do we all, Margaret said dismissively. Let's continue. They worked through the afternoon, breaking only for coffee and brief bathroom visits. Caleb caught 2 more potential problems, one involving currency exchange protocols, another related to intellectual property definitions that would have created ownership disputes. Each time, he explained the issue clearly, suggested alternatives, and watched the room's respect for his presence grow. Each time, he also watched Evelyn die a little more inside. There was no satisfaction in it, not really. He'd expected to feel vindicated, triumphant, proven right after a lifetime of being dismissed. Instead, he just felt tired and a little sad, because Evelyn's downfall wasn't about justice or karma or any of the narratives people like to tell themselves about how the world worked. It was about competence and preparation and being given a chance to demonstrate worth. Things she'd never offered him, things she probably never offered most people. I think we've made excellent progress, Margaret finally said as the light outside shifted toward evening. Mr. Ashford will draft revised terms incorporating Mr. Moore's suggestions. We'll reconvene next week to finalize. Agreed, Rodriguez said, standing and extending his hand. Thank you for your flexibility and openness to collaboration. Thank you for bringing proper expertise, Margaret replied, shaking firmly. Then she turned to Caleb. Mr. Moore, I'd like a word with you privately before you leave. Rodriguez's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. The room cleared slowly, people gathering tablets and phones, making small talk, pretending they hadn't just witnessed Evelyn Hartman getting systematically dismantled by the man she'd humiliated 2 days earlier. Evelyn was the last to leave. She stopped next to Caleb on her way out, close enough that only he could hear her whisper, "This isn't over." Then she was gone, heels clicking against marble, leaving behind only the faint scent of expensive perfume and burning bridges. Margaret Winchester waited until the door closed. Then she turned to Caleb with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You handled yourself remarkably well today, especially given the circumstances." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." She pulled out her phone, scrolled for a moment, then showed him the screen. It was a news article from a financial blog posted less than an hour ago. The headline read, "Hartman Global's reputation crisis deepens as fired janitor becomes corporate consultant." Caleb's stomach dropped. How did they... Someone in this building talked to a reporter. Probably one of Evelyn's people, trying to make you look like an opportunist riding her failure. Margaret's smile was grim. It's going to backfire spectacularly. The article is already going viral. People love an underdog story, especially when it involves a powerful CEO getting shown up by someone she dismissed. "I didn't want this." "No, but you have it anyway, and you need to decide what you're going to do with it." Margaret pocketed her phone. Evelyn Hartman is dangerous when cornered. She has resources, connections, and a very strong motivation to destroy your credibility before you destroy hers. This article is just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, you're going to face scrutiny you can't imagine. People will dig into your past, question your qualifications, accuse you of fraud or opportunism, or worse. Are you prepared for that? Caleb thought about his tiny apartment, his mountain of debt, his carefully constructed invisibility that was now burning away like morning fog. "I don't know." That's an honest answer. I respect that. Margaret studied him with those sharp eyes. "Let me tell you something about power, Mr. Moore. Real power isn't about having the most money or the most connections. It's about being underestimated. You've been invisible your whole life, which means people have been talking freely around you, revealing things they never would have said to someone they considered important. That's a gift. Don't waste it by trying to become just another corporate consultant in an expensive suit. What should I do instead? Stay exactly who you are. The man who speaks truth, even when it costs him everything. The man who sees what everyone else misses because they're too busy looking at surfaces." Margaret headed toward the door, then paused. "And watch your back." Evelyn made a threat. She meant it. After she left, Caleb stood alone in the empty conference room, looking out at the harbor where ships moved through water like pieces on a board game played by giants. His phone buzzed continuously with messages, coworkers from the building, friends he hadn't talked to in years, numbers he didn't recognize, all reaching out about the article, about his sudden visibility, about the impossible thing he'd somehow done. He should have felt victorious. He'd walked into a room designed to crush him and emerged not just intact but elevated. He'd proven his worth to people who mattered. He'd shown Evelyn Hartman exactly how wrong she'd been about him. But all he felt was the weight of Margaret Winchester's warning and the memory of Evelyn's whispered threat and the growing realization that he'd just traded one kind of invisibility for another kind of target. His phone rang. "Rodriguez. Have you seen the article?" Caleb asked. "Everyone's seen the article. It has 2 million views and counting." Rodriguez sounded grimly amused. "You're famous, my friend. Or infamous. Hard to tell the difference these days. Mrs. Winchester said Evelyn's going to come after me. She's right. Evelyn doesn't forgive, and she doesn't forget. She'll use every resource she has to discredit you, to make you look like an opportunist or a fraud or whatever narrative serves her interests." Rodriguez paused. "But here's the thing. She can only destroy you if you're trying to be something you're not. Stay authentic, stay honest, and most importantly, stay valuable. As long as you're delivering real results, people like Margaret Winchester will protect you from people like Evelyn Hartman. And if I'm not delivering results, then you'll learn very quickly how fragile corporate loyalty really is." Rodriguez's voice softened. "But I don't think that's going to happen. You proved yourself today. Now you just have to keep proving yourself every day until people stop questioning whether you belong and start wondering how they ever functioned without you. After the call ended, Caleb gathered his things and headed for the elevator. The building felt different now, not because it had changed, but because he had. 2 days ago, he'd walked through buildings like this as a ghost. Today, he walked through as someone people noticed, someone who mattered. The lobby was nearly empty when he stepped out, but there, standing near the security desk, was a figure he recognized. Evelyn. She was alone. No assistant, no entourage. Just her and a phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and urgent. She didn't see him at first, too focused on whatever conversation was consuming her attention. Caleb should have kept walking, should have slipped past while she was distracted, avoided any confrontation that might make things worse. But something made him stop. Some instinct that had been honed through years of invisibility, of listening to conversations people didn't know he could understand, of recognizing when something important was happening just outside his awareness. He couldn't hear her exact words, but he caught fragments, pieces of a larger picture. Legal team is investigating. Don't care what it costs. Find something we can use. Background, employment history, anything. She was already doing it, already mobilizing resources to destroy him, exactly as Margaret had predicted. Caleb stood there in the shadows of the lobby, visible but unnoticed, and listened to a woman with more money and power than he could imagine plot his systematic destruction. And he felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what he was up against. This wasn't a story about an underdog triumphing over adversity. This was a war, and he'd just won the first battle, which meant the real fight was only beginning. Evelyn ended her call and turned. Their eyes met across the lobby. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Evelyn smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that held no humor at all. "See you next week, Mr. Moore," she called out. "I'm looking forward to it." She walked away, leaving Caleb alone in the vast lobby with the certainty that everything was about to get much, much worse. The attack came faster than Caleb expected. He woke up the next morning to 17 missed calls and a text from Rodriguez that just said, "Don't read the news, call me first." Caleb read the news. The Financial Observer had published a feature story at 6 a.m., timed perfectly to catch the morning commute. The headline was crafted with surgical precision. From janitor to consultant, the curious rise of Caleb Moore, and questions about Vanguard International's judgment. The article didn't outright call him a fraud. It was too sophisticated for that. Instead, it raised questions, concerns, noted inconsistencies. Why would a man with a Columbia scholarship drop out so close to graduation? How exactly did someone learn multiple languages to professional fluency from library books? Wasn't it convenient that Rodriguez hired him immediately after a very public humiliation of a competitor? Sources close to Hartman Global suggested the entire lobby incident might have been staged, an elaborate setup designed to embarrass Evelyn Hartman and position Rodriguez's company as the ethical alternative. The journalist had done their homework. They'd found his academic records, his employment history, even tracked down 2 former professors from Columbia who remembered him as gifted but erratic and brilliant but troubled. They'd interviewed people from the cleaning company who said he kept to himself and seemed like he thought he was better than everyone else. Every true fact was presented in the most damaging possible light, every ambiguity twisted into something suspicious. And at the center of it all was a single quoted paragraph from an unnamed source. Caleb Moore is a talented individual who has faced genuine hardships, but his sudden elevation to corporate consultant raises serious questions about whether Vanguard International is making sound business decisions or simply engaging in revenge theater against a competitor. Real expertise requires more than linguistic ability. It requires judgment, emotional stability, and professional maturity. Mr. Moore's pattern of educational abandonment and job instability suggests he may lack these crucial qualities. Caleb read it 3 times, feeling something cold spread through his chest with each pass. They'd made him sound unstable, opportunistic, a charity case that Rodriguez was using as a weapon. His phone rang. Rodriguez. "I told you not to read it," Rodriguez said without preamble. "You knew this was coming." "I knew something was coming. I didn't expect it to be this thorough or this fast." paper rustled on Rodriguez's end. Evelyn didn't do this herself. She hired Whitmore Communications. They specialize in reputation management and strategic demolition. Very expensive. Very effective. So what do I do? Nothing. You do absolutely nothing. Rodriguez's voice was firm. This is bait, Caleb. They want you to respond emotionally, to defend yourself in ways that make you look defensive and guilty. The more you engage, the longer the story stays alive. We stay quiet, keep working, and let our results speak for themselves. Easy for you to say. It's not your credibility being destroyed. No, it's mine. Rodriguez's voice sharpened. Every word of that article is designed to make me look foolish for hiring you. It questions my judgment, my company's standards, my motivations. They're not just attacking you. They're attacking my decision to value you, and I will not give them the satisfaction of watching me back down. Caleb leaned against his kitchen counter, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. The professors they quoted. I remember them. One failed me on an exam because I corrected his Spanish in front of the class. The other told me I should focus on more realistic career goals for someone from my background. They weren't objective sources. They were people who already wanted me to fail. Which is exactly why we don't engage. Truth doesn't matter in stories like this. Narrative matters. And right now, the narrative is that you're either a con artist or a pawn. We change that narrative by making you indispensable. Rodriguez paused. The Winchester contract is being finalized tomorrow. There's a clause in the intellectual property section that's causing problems. Margaret Winchester's team and our legal counsel can't agree on the translation. I need you to fix it. When? Now. Klaus is sending you the documents. You have 4 hours to find a solution that both sides can accept. Rodriguez's voice softened slightly. I know you're hurting. I know this feels overwhelming. But the best response to people who doubt you is to prove them catastrophically wrong. So prove them wrong. The line went dead. Caleb's laptop chimed with incoming files. He opened them to find 30 pages of dense legal text in English and Spanish, with angry track changes from multiple reviewers and comment threads that had devolved into thinly veiled insults between the legal teams. The core problem was actually simple. Winchester wanted to retain full intellectual property rights to any semiconductor designs they developed, even if those designs were based on market research conducted by Vanguard in Latin America. Vanguard wanted recognition for their contribution to the innovation process, arguing that local market insights were what made the designs valuable in the first place. The English contract said one thing. The Spanish version said something slightly different, and both legal teams were dug in like they were defending Thermopylae. Caleb made coffee, opened a fresh document, and started working. The solution came to him around hour 3, born from something he'd learned not in any classroom but from listening to executives argue during late-night cleaning shifts. They weren't actually fighting about intellectual property. They were fighting about respect. Winchester didn't want to share credit with what they saw as a distribution partner. Vanguard didn't want to be treated as a mere vendor when they were providing the cultural intelligence that made innovation possible. So Caleb rewrote the clause to create a new category, culturally derived commercial insights. These insights would be jointly owned, but with Winchester retaining full technical IP rights and Vanguard retaining rights to the market research methodologies. It acknowledged both contributions without diminishing either. In Spanish, he used language that emphasized collaborative partnership rather than hierarchical ownership. In English, he emphasized clear boundaries and distinct spheres of expertise. He sent it to Klaus at exactly the 4-hour mark. The response came in under a minute. Brilliant. How did you think of this? Caleb typed back. I listened to people argue about it for 5 years while emptying their trash. An hour later, Rodriguez called again. Both legal teams accepted your language with minimal modifications. Margaret Winchester called me personally to say you just saved them 3 weeks of negotiation. The contract is being signed Monday. That's good. That's not just good. That's career-making. Rodriguez sounded energized, almost triumphant. I'm forwarding you something. Check your email. Caleb opened his laptop. The email contained a link to another news article, this one from a respected business journal. The headline read, The Invisible Expert, How Caleb Moore's Unlikely Journey Reveals Corporate America's Blind Spots. The article was different. It acknowledged the Financial Observer's piece, but then systematically dismantled it. The journalist had done their own research, finding different professors from Columbia who remembered Caleb as one of the most naturally gifted linguists I've ever taught, and someone who should have gone on to an exceptional career. They'd tracked down the original deal between Rodriguez and Hartman, obtained copies of the contract that had collapsed, and gotten 3 independent legal experts to confirm that the mistranslation was real, and Caleb's identification of it was legitimate and impressive. But more than that, the article framed Caleb's story as part of a larger pattern. How many brilliant people were trapped in jobs below their capability because of circumstances, because of class barriers, because of a system that measured worth by credentials rather than competence? How many janitors and housekeepers and service workers moved through corporate spaces understanding more than the executives who employed them, seeing solutions to problems that were invisible to the people in charge? The article ended with a quote from Margaret Winchester. Mr. Moore represents what corporate America claims to want, but rarely actually seeks out, raw talent developed through adversity rather than privilege. If his sudden prominence makes us uncomfortable, perhaps we should examine why we're more comfortable with mediocrity that comes with the right pedigree than excellence that comes from the wrong background. She gave an interview? Caleb asked when Rodriguez picked up. She did more than that. She's making you her personal project. Margaret Winchester decides every few years that someone in the corporate world needs defending, and she uses her considerable influence to make it happen. Congratulations. You're her current crusade. I don't want to be anyone's crusade. Too late. You're a symbol now. The underdog who proved the system wrong. People are going to project all kinds of narratives onto you whether you want them to or not. Rodriguez paused. But here's what matters. You earned this. Not through manipulation or luck or someone's pity, but through actual competence. Don't let anyone take that away from you, including yourself. Over the next 3 days, Caleb watched his life transform in ways he couldn't control. The Business Journal article went viral, spawning think pieces about class and education and hidden talent. Someone created a hashtag. College students started sharing stories about dropping out for family reasons. Service workers posted videos about conversations they'd overheard, while people treated them as invisible. Caleb became a cause, a movement, a referendum on American meritocracy. His phone never stopped ringing. Journalists wanted interviews, podcasts wanted appearances, literary agents wanted to discuss book deals. One streaming platform inquired about development rights to his life story. The attention was overwhelming, relentless, and completely disconnected from anything he'd actually done. Ignore all of it, Rodriguez advised during a meeting at Vanguard's office, where Caleb now had his own workspace overlooking the city. Do the work. Build the credibility. Everything else is noise. But the noise was getting louder and more dangerous. The second attack came on Thursday, this time from a political blog known for conspiracy theories and character assassination. They'd somehow obtained Caleb's sealed juvenile records, expunged arrests from when he was 15, desperate and hungry and stealing food from corner stores to feed himself in foster care. The blogger presented these decades-old crimes as evidence of criminal tendencies and deceptive character, implying that Caleb had manipulated Rodriguez and Winchester into trusting someone with a hidden past. The story was garbage, legally questionable, ethically bankrupt, and factually misleading. The arrests had been expunged because they were the actions of a traumatized kid in an impossible situation. Any reasonable person would see that. But reasonable wasn't the point. The point was to create doubt, to make people wonder, to turn his story from inspiration to cautionary tale. "This is Evelyn," Klaus said bluntly when they gathered in Rodriguez's office to address the new crisis. "She's getting desperate. These juvenile records were sealed. Someone with resources and connections leaked them to exactly the kind of outlet that would weaponize them without fact-checking." "Can we sue?" Sarah asked. "We can try, but that keeps the story alive and makes Caleb look like he's trying to hide something." Klaus looked exhausted. "This is a masterclass in reputation warfare. Every time we successfully counter one narrative, they introduce a new one. Eventually, people stop caring about truth and just remember that this guy's name keeps appearing in controversial stories." "So what's our play?" Rodriguez demanded. "We need Evelyn to overplay her hand," Sarah said slowly. Right now, she's operating through proxies, anonymous sources, strategic leaks. She's too smart to get caught. But if we can make her angry enough, make her desperate enough, maybe she makes a mistake we can prove. How do we do that? Caleb asked. He felt strangely detached from the conversation, like they were discussing a stranger's life rather than his own. By succeeding. Rodriguez leaned forward. The Winchester contract signing is Monday. It's going to be a major press event. Margaret Winchester is personally announcing the partnership and crediting you by name for resolving the deal's most complicated obstacle. That's Evelyn's nightmare scenario. You being publicly celebrated for the exact skills she dismissed while her company's reputation continues to crater. So we provoke her into doing something stupid by rubbing her face in my success. Caleb heard the bitterness in his own voice. We provoke her into revealing who she really is, Rodriguez corrected. Right now she's operating in shadows. We force her into the light. The Winchester Technologies building was transformed for the contract signing. Press from 3 countries. Executives in suits that cost more than cars. Security so tight that Caleb had to show ID 4 times just to reach the main conference room. Margaret Winchester had orchestrated the event with the precision of a military operation. The signing would happen at a table positioned so cameras captured both parties equally. Speeches would be brief but substantive. And critically, there would be a Q&A session where journalists could ask about the deal's unusual origins. They're going to ask about you, Margaret told Caleb before the event began. She'd pulled him aside into a private office, away from the controlled chaos outside. About your background, your qualifications, the controversies. Are you prepared? I don't know what prepared looks like anymore. It looks like telling the truth without apologizing for it. Margaret studied him with those sharp eyes. You've spent your life making yourself small so other people would feel comfortable. Today, you're going to do the opposite. You're going to take up exactly as much space as you've earned. Can you do that? Caleb thought about the lobby 2 weeks ago. About Evelyn's contempt and Rodriguez's gamble and his own decision to speak up when silence would have been safer. Yes. Good. Because Evelyn is out there, and she's planning something. I can feel it. The conference room was packed. Caleb found himself positioned between Rodriguez and Klaus, facing a wall of cameras and journalists and executives pretending this was just another corporate event rather than a public showdown wrapped in press release language. And there, in the 3rd row, sat Evelyn Hartman. She wore white today, a power move, suggesting purity and innocence. Her expression was serene, almost pleasant. She looked like someone attending a colleague's celebration rather than her own public humiliation, which meant Margaret was right. She was planning something. The signing itself was anticlimactic. Pens moving across paper, handshakes, smiles, the performance of corporate harmony. Then came the speeches, Winchester praising innovation and partnership, Rodriguez emphasizing cultural collaboration and mutual respect. All the expected platitudes delivered with just enough sincerity to feel genuine. Then Margaret Winchester stepped to the microphone and went off script. I want to say something about how this deal came together, she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. 3 weeks ago, it was dead. Not because the business case wasn't sound, but because trust had broken down. Miscommunication had created suspicion. Cultural differences had been weaponized rather than understood. We were days away from losing something valuable because we were too proud or too blind to see past our own assumptions. The room had gone very quiet. This wasn't the usual corporate messaging. What saved this partnership was simple. Someone saw what the rest of us missed. Someone whose job was to be invisible noticed that the people in charge weren't actually communicating. We were just performing communication, and he had the courage to speak up, even though it cost him personally, even though no one expected him to have anything valuable to contribute. Margaret's eyes found Caleb in the crowd. Mr. Moore, would you join me up here? Caleb's legs moved on autopilot, carrying him to the front of the room while his brain screamed that this wasn't the plan, this wasn't what they'd discussed. But Margaret's hand was on his shoulder, positioning him next to her in front of every camera in the room, and there was no escape. Caleb Moore dropped out of Columbia University to care for his dying mother, Margaret continued. He spent the next decade working jobs that people like us consider beneath our notice, while teaching himself skills that most of us pay thousands of dollars to acquire. He saw the fraud in a contract that 5 lawyers missed. He solved a negotiation problem that was about to kill this deal. And he did it all while being told he wasn't qualified, wasn't professional, wasn't worth listening to. She paused, letting that sink in. How many other Caleb Moores are out there? How many brilliant people are we overlooking because we're measuring worth by the wrong metrics? The journalists erupted with questions. Margaret pointed to one in the front row. Ms. Winchester, are you saying Mr. Moore is now a formal consultant to Winchester Technologies? I'm saying Mr. Moore represents the kind of talent that corporate America claims to value, but systematically excludes. And yes, Winchester will be engaging his services going forward. Another journalist. Mr. Moore, how do you respond to allegations that your background includes criminal activity and academic failure? The room held its breath. This was the moment they'd been building toward. The trap being set. Caleb could feel Evelyn's eyes on him, waiting to see if he'd crumble. He stepped to the microphone. I was arrested twice as a teenager for stealing food. The charges were expunged because I was a kid in foster care who was hungry and scared and doing what I had to do to survive. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed of it either because I know exactly what desperation feels like. And I know that people make different choices when the alternative is starvation. His voice was steady. As for academic failure, I left Columbia because my mother had cancer and someone needed to take care of her. I chose her over my education. I'd make the same choice again. But doesn't that raise questions about your commitment? It raises questions about what we value, Caleb interrupted, surprising himself. I've worked with executives who've never had to choose between their career and their family's survival, who've never missed a meal they didn't choose to miss, who've never been invisible to the people making decisions that affect their lives. They're not better than me. They're just luckier. And if that makes me unqualified, then maybe we need to rethink what qualification means. The room exploded with more questions, but Margaret raised her hand. One more question, then we need to wrap up. A journalist in the back stood up. Caleb recognized her immediately, Diane Chen from the Financial Observer, the publication that had written the first hit piece about him. This question is for Ms. Hartman. Every head in the room swiveled toward Evelyn. She stood gracefully, her smile never wavering. Yes? You were present during the lobby incident that started all of this. You witnessed Mr. Moore identify the contract fraud. Given his obvious competence, do you regret how you treated him that night? It was a kill shot disguised as journalism. There was no good answer. Apologizing made her look weak. Doubling down made her look cruel. Deflecting made her look cowardly. Evelyn's smile widened. I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about that evening. Yes, I was frustrated during a difficult negotiation. Yes, my words in the moment were perhaps harsher than necessary, but the narrative that's emerged, that I fired Mr. Moore for speaking up, is incomplete. She paused for effect. Mr. Moore wasn't fired for identifying a problem with the contract. He was fired for violating the confidentiality agreement all building service employees sign. He accessed and disclosed information about a private business negotiation without authorization. That's a terminable offense, regardless of whether his information proved accurate. The room shifted. Caleb felt it immediately. The change in energy, the recalculation of who was telling the truth. It was a brilliant countermove. Evelyn had just reframed the entire narrative, turning his moment of courage into a violation of professional ethics. That's not true, Caleb said, but his voice came out weaker than he intended. Actually, it is. Evelyn pulled out a tablet, projecting an image onto the screens around the room. It was a contract, a confidentiality agreement with his signature at the bottom, dated from 5 years ago when he'd first been hired. This is standard for all employees who work in buildings housing sensitive corporate information. Section 7, subsection B clearly states that employees are forbidden from disclosing or commenting on any business information they may become aware of during their duties. Mr. Moore signed this agreement. Then he violated it. The contract was fraudulent, Rodriguez said, standing. He was exposing a crime. He was interfering in a private business negotiation he had no authority to be part of, Evelyn corrected smoothly. Whether his information was accurate is irrelevant to whether he breached his employment contract. And frankly, I'm disturbed that we're celebrating someone for violating professional obligations just because the outcome happened to be convenient for one party. Caleb watched the journalist process this, watched the doubt creep back in. Evelyn had done it, taken the story of a brave janitor speaking truth to power and turned it into a story of an employee who didn't understand professional boundaries. "May I see that contract?" Margaret Winchester's voice cut through the murmuring. Evelyn's smile flickered. "I'm sorry?" "The confidentiality agreement. I'd like to examine it." Margaret held out her hand. "Surely you don't mind, since you're using it as evidence in a public forum." For the first time, Evelyn looked uncertain. But she couldn't refuse, not with every camera in the room watching. She passed the tablet to Margaret. Margaret studied it in silence for a long moment. Then she looked up, and her expression was colder than Caleb had ever seen it. "This confidentiality agreement was revised 6 days ago." The room went deadly quiet. "That's impossible," Evelyn said, but there was something wrong with her voice now. "The metadata is right here." Margaret turned the tablet around, showing the screen to the room. "Original document dated 5 years ago, as you said, but Section 7, subsection B, the clause you just cited, was added on November 21st of this year, 4 days after Mr. Moore was fired." She paused, letting that land. "You backdated a revision to a confidentiality agreement to retroactively justify terminating an employee. That's not just unethical, it's potentially criminal." Evelyn's face had gone white. "That must be a technical error. Your legal team committed fraud." Margaret's voice was ice. "And you just committed perjury, or whatever the corporate equivalent is when you lie to journalists using manufactured evidence." The room erupted. Journalists shouting questions, cameras flashing, executives from both companies looking at each other in shock, and Evelyn Hartman standing frozen in place, her perfect composure finally cracking as she realized what she'd just done. She'd tried to destroy Caleb with manufactured evidence in front of dozens of witnesses. Security was moving toward her now. Margaret Winchester had already pulled out her phone, speaking rapidly to someone on the other end. Rodriguez's hand was on Caleb's shoulder, steady and grounding. "That's it," Klaus said quietly. "That's the mistake we needed. She's done." Evelyn's eyes found Caleb's across the chaotic room. There was no more calculation in them, no more strategy. Just raw, desperate fury, and something that might have been fear. Then she was being escorted out, still trying to maintain dignity as her empire collapsed around her, and Caleb was surrounded by people asking if he was all right, if he needed anything, telling him how brave he was, how vindicated he must feel. But all he felt was tired, and sad, and strangely empty. Because this wasn't supposed to be how the story ended, with someone's career destroyed, with public humiliation, with victory that tasted like ash because it came at such a brutal cost. "Mr. Moore," Diane Chen from the Financial Observer approached carefully. "I owe you an apology. Our first article about you relied on sources we should have vetted more carefully, sources who clearly had an agenda." "Sources Evelyn Hartman provided," Caleb said flatly. "Yes." Diane had the grace to look ashamed. "I'd like to write a follow-up, a real one. Your actual story, not the narrative someone wanted us to tell." "Maybe later." Caleb was watching the door where Evelyn had disappeared. "Right now, I need some air." He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the voices calling his name, and found an emergency exit that led to a maintenance stairwell, the kind of space he used to inhabit, the kind of space where people like him belonged, according to the world's original assessment. He sat down on the concrete steps and put his head in his hands. Footsteps echoed from above. Margaret Winchester appeared, moving with surprising ease in heels that probably cost more than his rent. She sat down next to him without asking permission. "You know what the worst part is?" Caleb said after a long silence. "I think she actually believed her own narrative. She convinced herself that I was a threat, that I'd violated something sacred, that she was the victim in all of this. And maybe in some twisted way, she was right. She wasn't right. Wasn't she? I did break her deal. I did cost her company millions. I did interfere in something that wasn't my business." Caleb looked up at Margaret. "The fact that I was ethically correct doesn't change the fact that I destroyed something she'd built." She destroyed it herself by tolerating fraud. You just made it visible. Margaret was quiet for a moment. You want to know why I'm helping you? It's not charity, and it's not because I think you're some noble underdog. It's because I've spent 40 years in corporate America watching brilliant people get crushed by mediocre people who happen to be born into the right circumstances. I've watched talent wasted. I've watched potential destroyed, and I got tired of watching. She stood, brushing off her suit. Evelyn Hartman is dangerous because she represents a system that values appearance over substance, credentials over competence, comfort over truth. You're dangerous because you prove that system wrong just by existing. Don't apologize for that.
Was?
She left him alone in the stairwell where he belonged and didn't belong, where he'd spent years being invisible and couldn't hide anymore. His phone buzzed, a message from a number he didn't recognize. You won. Congratulations. I hope it was worth it. Evelyn. One last poison dart before she disappeared. Caleb stared at the message for a long time. Then he deleted it and headed back upstairs, where his new life was waiting, whether he was ready for it or not. The victory party happened without Caleb. He'd slipped away from the Winchester building while people were still congratulating each other, still processing Evelyn's spectacular downfall, still trying to reconcile the narrative they'd believed with the truth that had just detonated in front of them. Rodriguez had texted 3 times asking where he'd gone. Margaret Winchester had left a voicemail expressing concern. Klaus had simply sent, "Take the time you need, but don't disappear." Caleb rode the subway home in silence, surrounded by people who had no idea they were sitting next to someone whose face had been on 3 major news sites that day. The anonymity was a gift. For an hour, he could pretend he was still invisible, still just another body moving through the city's veins, still safe in the obscurity he'd built so carefully over the years. His apartment felt smaller than he remembered, or maybe he'd gotten too big for it. He dropped his jacket on the futon, loosened the tie that still felt like a noose around his neck, and stared at the water stain on his ceiling that looked like South America. 2 weeks ago, he'd been lying here wondering if he could pick up extra shifts. Now he was the subject of think pieces about corporate justice and the American dream. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from numbers he didn't recognize, interview requests, congratulations from people he'd never met. He turned it off and sat in the dark, listening to his upstairs neighbor's television bleeding through the thin walls, and tried to figure out what he was feeling. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just a hollow ache where those emotions should have been, and the persistent image of Evelyn's face when Margaret had revealed the doctored contract. The shock. The fear. The moment when someone who'd spent her life being certain about everything suddenly had no ground beneath her feet. He knew that feeling, had lived it most of his life, and he'd just inflicted it on someone else, in front of cameras and witnesses and the entire corporate world that would never let her forget it. The knock on his door came around 9. Caleb ignored it at first, assuming it was a neighbor or a wrong address. But it persisted, patient and steady, until he finally dragged himself up and looked through the peephole. Rodriguez. "I know you're in there," Rodriguez called through the door. "Your neighbor downstairs told me which apartment. Very nice woman. She wanted to know if you're the same Caleb Moore from the news. I said yes. She said you deserve everything good that's happening to you." Caleb opened the door. "How did you know where I live?" "Your employment file from the cleaning company, which I accessed legally before you ask." Rodriguez held up a bag from a Thai restaurant. "I brought food. You haven't eaten since this morning. May I come in?" The apartment looked even smaller with Rodriguez in it. The man seemed too polished, too put together for the chipped linoleum and secondhand furniture. But he sat on the futon without hesitation, unpacking containers of pad thai and spring rolls like this was the most natural thing in the world. "You left," Rodriguez said, not quite making it a question. "I needed air." "You needed distance." Rodriguez handed him a container and chopsticks. "From the celebration, from the attention, from the reality of what just happened. I understand that, but disappearing worries people who care about you." "People don't care about me. They care about what I represent." Caleb picked at the noodles without appetite. "I'm a symbol, a convenient narrative about underdogs and justice. Tomorrow there will be a different symbol and everyone will forget I exist." "That's partially true and completely wrong. Rodriguez ate with the efficiency of someone who viewed food as fuel. Yes, you've become symbolic, but that doesn't make the real you less important. And the people who actually know you, Klaus, Sarah, Margaret, me, we care about the human, not the symbol. You've known me for 2 weeks. I've known you long enough to see who you are when everything is falling apart. That tells me more than years of casual acquaintance. Rodriguez set down his food. Let me tell you what happened after you left. Evelyn Hartman was escorted from the building by security. Within an hour, Hartman Global's board called an emergency meeting. By this evening, she'd been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Her reputation, which she spent 20 years building, is gone, destroyed in a single afternoon. Good, Caleb said, but the word felt wrong in his mouth. Is it? Because you don't look like someone celebrating justice. You look like someone who's just realized that revenge doesn't feel the way you thought it would. And Caleb set down the food he couldn't eat. She tried to destroy me. She weaponized my past, my poverty, everything I've ever struggled with. She hired people to dig up sealed juvenile records. She fabricated evidence. She deserved what happened. She did, Rodriguez agreed. But that doesn't mean you have to enjoy it. Justice and satisfaction aren't the same thing. Sometimes they're not even related. They ate in silence for a while, or Rodriguez ate while Caleb pushed noodles around his container. Outside, sirens wailed. Someone shouted in a language Caleb recognized as Cantonese. The city continued its indifferent rotation, unconcerned with the small dramas of individual lives. What happens now? Caleb finally asked. With Evelyn? Legal investigations, possibly criminal charges for the contract fraud and the evidence tampering. At minimum, her career is over. She'll never hold another major corporate position. Rodriguez paused. With you? That's more interesting. Margaret Winchester wants to create a new position at her company, Director of Cross-Cultural Communication. She wants you for it. The salary would be substantial. I've been a consultant for 2 weeks. That's not enough experience to direct anything. You've been observing corporate culture and communication failures for years. You just weren't in a position where anyone valued that observation. Rodriguez leaned forward. Caleb, do you know why most cross-cultural business deals fail? It's not because of language barriers. Professional translators handle that. It fails because of invisible assumptions, because of cultural contexts that don't translate, because people like Evelyn Hartman believe their way of doing business is the only legitimate way. What you have isn't just linguistic skill. It's cultural intelligence developed from years of being on the outside looking in. That's rare. That's valuable. Or I got lucky a few times and everyone's overreacting. Stop that. Rodriguez's voice sharpened. Stop diminishing yourself. Stop questioning whether you've earned what you're being offered. You identified fraud that 5 lawyers missed. You resolved a negotiation deadlock that was killing a $1 billion deal. You stood in front of a room full of hostile questions and spoke your truth without flinching. Those aren't accidents. Those are demonstrations of exceptional ability. Caleb wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that maybe he wasn't an imposter wearing clothes that didn't fit, playing a role he hadn't earned. But years of being dismissed don't disappear in 2 weeks, no matter how dramatic the reversal. I keep thinking about what Evelyn said, Caleb admitted quietly, about me violating confidentiality, about interfering in business that wasn't mine. She was lying about the contract revision, but the core accusation wasn't completely wrong. I did speak up about something I wasn't authorized to be part of. I did cost her a major deal. If the contract hadn't actually been fraudulent, would I have been the villain in this story? But it was fraudulent. Reality matters, Caleb. Hypotheticals don't. Do they? Because from where I'm sitting, the only difference between me being celebrated and me being fired is whether the information I revealed served the right people's interests. That's not justice. That's just power dynamics with better PR. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying Caleb with an expression that was hard to read. You're right, he finally said. If you'd been wrong, if the contract had been legitimate and you'd still spoken up, you would have been fired and forgotten. The system doesn't reward courage. It rewards correct courage. Courage that serves existing power structures or tears down the right enemies. That's unfair and frustrating and absolutely true. So what's the point? The point is that you were right. and being right matters, even in a system that only sometimes rewards it. You saved my company from fraud. You exposed corruption. You demonstrated that intelligence and worth aren't determined by credentials or social class. Those things have value independent of whether they're recognized. Rodriguez stood, gathering the empty containers. But I understand your crisis. You thought exposing injustice would feel triumphant. Instead, it feels complicated and exhausting and morally ambiguous. Welcome to adulthood. It doesn't get less complicated from here. After Rodriguez left, Caleb sat alone with his thoughts in his too small apartment and the growing certainty that his old life was gone and his new life didn't fit right either. He was trapped in the space between invisibility and visibility, belonging nowhere, comfortable in neither role. His phone buzzed. He'd turned it back on after Rodriguez left, and now messages flooded in with the relentless efficiency of digital attention. Most were congratulatory. Some were interview requests. A few were from old acquaintances who hadn't spoken to him in years, suddenly wanting to reconnect. But one message stood out. From Sarah Chen. Legal note. Evelyn's lawyers are threatening to sue you personally for defamation and tortious interference. Don't panic. It's a desperate Hail Mary and it won't go anywhere. But you should know. Caleb stared at the message. Even in defeat, even with her career in ruins, Evelyn was still fighting, still trying to drag him down with her. The woman didn't know how to stop, or maybe she knew exactly what she was doing. Maybe this was her final play. If she couldn't win, she'd make sure winning cost Caleb everything he had. He called Sarah. She picked up on the first ring. I saw the message, Caleb said. How worried should I be? On a scale of 1 to 10, maybe a 3. Her case is weak and everyone knows it. She'd have to prove you lied, which you didn't, and that you caused her harm through deception, which is laughable given that she's the one who fabricated evidence. Sarah's voice was clinical, professional. But here's the thing about lawsuits. They don't have to be legitimate to be destructive. Even a frivolous case costs time and money to defend. She knows that. She's banking on making your life difficult enough that you give up, apologize, or somehow validate her version of events. What do I do? Nothing yet. Rodriguez and I are handling it. We've already got Winchester's legal team involved. Between the 3 companies, we can bury her in countersuits until she backs down. Sarah paused. But I need you to understand something. This isn't over. Evelyn has resources and connections and nothing left to lose. She's going to keep fighting, keep attacking, keep trying to pull you down. You need to decide if you can handle that. What choice do I have? You always have a choice. You could settle, issue some vague statement about misunderstandings. Let her save a little face. Go back to being invisible. Sarah's voice was gentle. No one would blame you. This has been intense, and it's only going to get worse before it gets better. Caleb thought about the lobby 2 weeks ago, about Evelyn splashing mop water and laughing while investors looked away in embarrassment, about years of being dismissed and overlooked and treated as less than human by people who never bothered to learn his name. No, he said, I'm not settling. I'm not apologizing. I'm not giving her the satisfaction. Good. Sarah sounded satisfied. Then let's talk strategy. We need to control the narrative before she does. I've got media contacts who want your story, the real version, not the sound bites. You ready to go public? I thought Rodriguez said to stay quiet. That was before Evelyn decided to go nuclear. Now we fight back, but we fight smart. Papers rustled on Sarah's end. There's a journalist named Marcus Webb, no relation to our Marcus, who does long-form profiles for New York Magazine. He's respected, thorough, and he doesn't do hatchet jobs. I can set up an interview for tomorrow if you're willing. Caleb looked around his apartment, at the life he'd built from scraps and silence, at everything he'd tried to protect by staying invisible. It was all gone anyway, burned away by 2 weeks of unwanted attention and impossible choices. Set it up, he said. The interview happened in a cafe in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's corporate towers. Marcus Webb turned out to be younger than Caleb expected, maybe 30, with the kind of earnest intelligence that made you want to trust him immediately. They ordered coffee and settled into a corner booth where afternoon light painted everything gold. I appreciate you doing this, Marcus said, setting up a recorder with practiced ease. I know you've been swamped with interview requests. Why me? Sarah Chen said you're fair. That you care about getting stories right rather than just getting them first. I try, Marcus smiled. Let me be upfront about my angle. I'm not interested in the celebrity narrative. Janitor becomes corporate hero, underdog defeats villain. That's been covered. I'm interested in the structural story, what your experience reveals about class mobility, about hidden talent, about how we determine who deserves opportunities. That's the piece that matters long term. Sounds more like sociology than journalism. Good journalism is sociology. It's anthropology. It's trying to understand the systems that shape individual lives. Marcus leaned back. So let's start with the question everyone's dancing around. Do you think you'd be sitting here, being offered prestigious positions and media attention, if you were still cleaning floors? If nothing dramatic had happened, if Rodriguez hadn't needed you in that specific moment? Caleb considered lying. Considered the diplomatic answer that wouldn't alienate anyone. Then he remembered Margaret Winchester telling him to take up exactly as much space as he'd earned. No, he said, I'd still be invisible. My skills, my intelligence, my years of self-education, none of it would matter because no one would know it existed. I'd die in obscurity, and people like Evelyn Hartman would never even realize they'd walked past someone who understood their business better than they did. That bothers you. It should bother everyone. How much talent are we wasting because we only recognize it when it comes with the right packaging? How many brilliant people are cleaning our offices, serving our food, driving our cars, completely invisible because we've decided their jobs define their worth? Caleb felt something hot building in his chest. I got lucky. I happened to be in the right place at the right moment with the right skills. But there are thousands of people like me who never get that moment, and we act like that's fine, like that's how meritocracy works, when really it's just a lottery with terrible odds. Marcus was writing quickly, his pen scratching across paper even though the recorder was running. Tell me about the foster homes. Your juvenile record. What about it? Evelyn weaponized it, made it sound like evidence of bad character. But you were a kid stealing food to survive. That's not criminal behavior. That's a system failing to take care of children in its custody. Caleb felt old anger stirring, the kind he'd spent years burying because it served no purpose except to eat him alive from inside. I was placed with 7 different families between ages 12 and 17. 3 of those families only wanted the state money. 2 were actively abusive. 1 was decent but overwhelmed with too many kids and not enough resources. The last one was fine, but by then I'd learned not to depend on anyone. He paused, remembering. The first time I got arrested, I was 15. I'd been hungry for 2 days because my foster father had spent the grocery money on gambling. I took a sandwich from a deli. The owner caught me, called the cops, made a big scene. The police officer who responded looked at me like I was trash. Didn't ask why I was stealing, didn't care. Just processed me through the system and sent me back to the same house where I'd been starving. Did you tell anyone? Social workers? Teachers? Who would I tell? The social workers had caseloads in the hundreds. The teachers were overworked and underpaid. Everyone was doing their best with impossible situations. And I was just another statistic, another troubled kid from a bad background who'd probably end up in jail or dead before 30. That's how people saw me. That's how I learned to see myself. Marcus was quiet for a moment, still writing. When did that change? When did you start believing you could be more? I'm not sure I have. The admission surprised Caleb. He hadn't meant to be that honest. I'm sitting here in clothes that cost more than I used to make in a month, being interviewed for a major magazine, supposedly on my way to a director-level position at a Fortune 500 company. And I still feel like I'm one mistake away from being back in that deli, hungry and desperate and invisible. That feeling doesn't go away just because circumstances change. Is that why you look so uncomfortable at the contract signing, even when you were being celebrated? Caleb thought about that moment on the stage, with Margaret Winchester praising him and cameras flashing and the entire room watching. I kept thinking about all the people who weren't there, the other janitors at that building who are just as smart, just as capable, who'll never get a moment like that. My old coworkers who are still cleaning offices and emptying trash while people walk past them like they're furniture. Everyone who's trapped in the same invisibility I escaped. He met Marcus's eyes. My success doesn't fix the system. It just proves the system occasionally lets one person through while keeping everyone else locked out. So what do you do with that? With the guilt of escaping when others don't? I don't know yet. Caleb realized his coffee had gone cold. Rodriguez says I should focus on doing the work, proving my worth, building credibility. Margaret Winchester wants me to be some kind of symbol for recognizing hidden talent. Sarah Chen is helping me fight legal battles against someone who wants to destroy me. And I'm just trying to figure out who I am when I'm not invisible anymore. Marcus smiled. That's a better answer than any soundbite. That's human. They talked for 2 more hours. About Colombia and his mother's death and the years of night shifts learning languages from books he couldn't afford. About the moment in the lobby when he'd made the choice to speak up, about watching Evelyn's world collapse and feeling complicated about it. Marcus asked hard questions and didn't accept easy answers, pushing Caleb to articulate things he'd barely admitted to himself. By the time they finished, Caleb felt exhausted and somehow lighter. Like confession without the religious framework, just the basic human need to be heard and understood. This is going to be a big piece, Marcus said, packing up his recorder. People are going to read this and have opinions. Some will celebrate you. Some will say you're ungrateful, that you don't appreciate how lucky you've been. Some will use you as ammunition in their own political arguments. Can you handle that? I handled Evelyn Hartman. I can handle opinions. Evelyn was one person. This is the entire internet. Marcus's expression was sympathetic. But for what it's worth, I think you're doing something important. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been invisible. You're forcing people to see what they've been trained to overlook. That makes you dangerous. That makes you valuable. Try not to lose yourself in the process. After Marcus left, Caleb sat alone in the cafe and watched people pass by outside. Students and professionals and families and workers, all moving through their own narratives, all carrying invisible stories of struggle and survival and small triumphs that no one would ever celebrate. He wondered how many of them felt like imposters in their own lives. How many were just waiting for someone to notice that they didn't belong in the spaces they'd somehow managed to occupy. His phone rang. Unknown number, but local area code. He almost didn't answer. Mr. Moore? The voice was female, older, with an accent Caleb immediately recognized as Queen's Irish. My name is Catherine O'Brien. I'm a lawyer with Morrison & Associates. I'm calling on behalf of Evelyn Hartman. Caleb's entire body went cold. I'm not talking to you without my own lawyer present. I understand, but this isn't that kind of call. I'm not trying to intimidate you or threaten you or do any of the things you're probably imagining. She sounded tired. I'm calling because my client has asked me to deliver a message, and I think you should hear it. Why would I listen to anything Evelyn Hartman wants to say? Because she's offering to settle this quietly, to drop all legal action against you in exchange for a single meeting, just the two of you. No lawyers, no witnesses, no recordings. She wants a chance to explain herself. She had her chance to explain herself. She chose to fabricate evidence instead. I know. I've advised her that her legal position is untenable and her actions were indefensible. Catherine O'Brien's voice softened. But I've been practicing law for 30 years, Mr. Moore, and I've learned that sometimes people need closure more than they need victory. My client is facing criminal charges, professional ruin, and public humiliation. She's going to pay for what she did, but she's asking for one conversation with you before her life completely falls apart. That's not a legal strategy. That's a human request. Caleb wanted to say no, wanted to hang up and tell Sarah and Rodriguez and let them handle it through proper channels, wanted to maintain the distance that kept him safe from whatever manipulation Evelyn was planning, but he remembered her face in the lobby as security escorted her out. The fear beneath the fury. The way power looks when it realizes it's been an illusion all along. When? He heard himself ask. Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock. There's a park near the Winchester building, Battery Park. She'll be on a bench near the water, alone, as promised. If this is some kind of trap, it's not. I give you my word. For whatever a lawyer's word is worth. Catherine O'Brien paused. She just wants to talk, Mr. Moore, person to person, not CEO to janitor, not victim to villain, just two people whose lives collided in ways neither of them expected. After the call ended, Caleb sat with the weight of the decision. He should tell someone. Should bring Rodriguez or Sarah, or at least let people know where he was going. Meeting Evelyn alone was dangerous and stupid, and exactly the kind of impulsive choice that could destroy everything he'd built. But beneath the fear was something else. Curiosity. Or maybe the same impulse that had made him speak up in the lobby. The need to know, to understand, to see the human being beneath the power and cruelty and desperate need for control. He'd spent his life being invisible. Maybe it was time to see if Evelyn Hartman had been invisible too, buried beneath her own armor of certainty and corporate performance. He texted Sarah. Evelyn wants to meet. Tomorrow at 7. Battery Park. I'm going. Her response came in seconds. Are you insane? Probably, Caleb thought. But he texted back. Maybe. But I need to hear what she has to say. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Caleb tried to work, reviewing contracts for Rodriguez's next negotiation, but his mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. Klaus noticed his distraction and asked if everything was okay. Caleb lied and said he was fine. The lie felt heavier than usual, like he was betraying people who'd invested in him by keeping secrets. At 6:30, he left the Vanguard office and headed toward Battery Park. The evening was cool, autumn sliding into winter, and the city lights reflected off the water in fractured patterns. He found the bench Catherine O'Brien had described, positioned where someone could watch the harbor and the Statue of Liberty standing silent in the distance. Evelyn was already there. She looked smaller than he remembered. Not physically. She was still perfectly put together, still wearing clothes that cost more than his rent. But something essential had diminished. The certainty was gone. The armor had cracked. You came, she said, not looking at him. I wasn't sure you would. Caleb sat down at the far end of the bench, maintaining distance. Your lawyer said you wanted to explain yourself. So explain. There's nothing to explain. I did exactly what everyone knows I did. I tried to destroy you because you made me look foolish, and it backfired spectacularly. Evelyn's laugh was hollow. I'm not here to justify my actions or ask for forgiveness. I'm here because I need you to understand something, and then I'll leave you alone forever. What could I possibly need to understand? That you were right about me. Evelyn finally turned to face him, and Caleb saw something raw in her expression. In that lobby, when you said I'd rather lose billions than admit a janitor might know something I don't, you were absolutely right, and it destroyed me. The admission hung between them like smoke. I built everything I have on being the smartest person in the room, Evelyn continued, the one who saw things others missed, who made connections others couldn't, who succeeded because I was simply better than everyone else. That was my identity, my entire sense of self. And then you appeared, this man I'd never even noticed, and casually demonstrated that I'd missed something obvious, something important, something that anyone with actual competence would have caught. She looked back at the water. Do you know what that feels like? To realize your entire self-image is built on sand? Yes, Caleb said quietly. I know exactly what that feels like. Of course you do. You've spent your whole life being told you're worthless while knowing you're not. I spent my whole life being told I'm exceptional while secretly fearing I'm not. Evelyn's voice cracked slightly. When you exposed that fraud, you didn't just cost me a business deal. You confirmed my deepest fear, that I'm not actually as smart as I've convinced everyone I am, that I've been succeeding through privilege and performance rather than genuine ability, and I couldn't handle that. So I tried to destroy the evidence. I tried to destroy you. Caleb wanted to feel triumphant, wanted this confession to be the validation he'd been seeking. Instead, he just felt the familiar ache of recognizing himself in someone he'd been taught to hate. What do you want from me? He asked. Nothing. You don't owe me anything. Evelyn stood, straightening her coat with automatic precision. I just needed you to know that I see you now, really see you, not as a janitor or a symbol or a threat, but as a human being who deserves the opportunities I've always taken for granted. I destroyed my own life proving I couldn't see that. Don't let what I did poison who you're becoming. She walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the park's evening shadows, leaving Caleb alone with the weight of her words and the complicated realization that sometimes the people who hurt us most are fighting battles we can't see. He sat there for a long time, watching the water and thinking about invisibility and recognition and all the ways people protect themselves from truths they can't handle. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't read. The city continued its indifferent rotation around him. And for the first time since the lobby, Caleb felt something shift inside him. Not closure exactly, but the beginning of understanding that maybe this story wasn't about heroes and villains after all. Maybe it was just about people struggling to be seen, to matter, to prove their worth in a system that measured value in all the wrong ways. Maybe that's what made it real. The Marcus Webb profile dropped 3 days later and changed everything one final time. Caleb was in a meeting with Rodriguez and a team from a German manufacturing company when his phone started vibrating with such intensity that Klaus finally reached over and turned it face down on the conference table. But the interruption had already broken everyone's concentration, and the German executives were exchanging glances that suggested they knew exactly what was happening. "Perhaps we should take a break," their lead negotiator said in careful English. "It seems Mr. Moore is having a significant day." Rodriguez ended the meeting early with apologies and promises to reschedule. As soon as the Germans left, he turned to Caleb with an expression somewhere between concern and excitement. "Have you read it?" "Read what?" "The profile. It's everywhere. Twitter, LinkedIn, every business news site, 3 major television networks. Marcus Webb just published 15,000 words about you, and they're calling it the most important piece of business journalism this year." Klaus had already pulled it up on his laptop. The headline read, "The Invisible Expert, Caleb Moore, and the Talent We're All Missing." The featured image was a photo Marcus must have taken during their interview. Caleb in that Brooklyn cafe, looking out the window with an expression that managed to convey both exhaustion and determination. Caleb took the laptop and started reading. What Marcus had created wasn't just a profile. It was an indictment of corporate America's entire approach to recognizing talent, using Caleb's story as the lens through which to examine structural inequality, class barriers, and the mythology of meritocracy. The piece wove together interviews with economists, sociologists, and dozens of service workers who'd watched their intelligence be systematically dismissed by the people they served. But the most powerful parts were the direct quotes from Caleb himself. Things he'd said in the interview that he'd half forgotten, rendered on the page with devastating honesty. His admission about still feeling like an imposter, his anger at a system that only recognized talent by accident, his complicated feelings about Evelyn's destruction, his guilt over escaping invisibility while others remained trapped. Marcus had taken the messy, contradictory truth of his experience and shaped it into something that felt both deeply personal and universally resonant. The piece didn't make Caleb a hero. It made him human. And that, apparently, was what people had been waiting for. "It's brilliant," Sarah said, reading over Klaus's shoulder. "He positioned you as sympathetic but not saintly, self-aware but not self-pitying. This is going to shift the entire conversation." She was right. By that evening, Caleb had received interview requests from every major news network, invitations to speak at 3 universities, and a message from a literary agent who wanted to discuss a book deal. The hashtag from weeks earlier had resurged with new energy, this time focused less on Caleb specifically and more on the systemic issues his story illuminated. But the message that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Margaret Winchester's assistant called to say that Mrs. Winchester wanted to see Caleb the next morning. Not about business, about something personal. Caleb arrived at Winchester Technologies at 8 a.m. to find Margaret waiting in her office, which was surprisingly modest for someone of her wealth and power. Books lined the walls. Photos showed her with various world leaders and business titans, but also with ordinary workers, factory employees, researchers, people whose names no one would recognize. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair. "I read the profile. Multiple times, actually. There's a quote in there that I can't stop thinking about. You said, 'My success doesn't fix the system. It just proves the system occasionally lets one person through while keeping everyone else locked out.' Do you still believe that?" "Yes." "Good. Because I want to talk to you about actually fixing the system, or at least making a meaningful dent in it." Margaret pulled out a folder thick with documents. Winchester Technologies employs 12,000 people globally. About 35% of those are in positions we'd classify as support services: cleaning, maintenance, food service, security. Most of them have been with us for years, some for decades. And I realized while reading your story that I have no idea what kind of talent we're wasting because we've never bothered to actually assess it. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. What are you proposing? A pilot program. We identify 20 employees currently in service positions and offer them comprehensive skills assessments, linguistic, technical, analytical, whatever their particular strengths might be. Then we create pathways for them to transition into roles that match their actual capabilities, rather than their current job descriptions. Margaret leaned forward. I want you to design it, to implement it, to prove that what happened with you wasn't a fluke, but rather the natural result of finally paying attention to talent we've been trained to overlook. That's ambitious and expensive. So is wasting human potential. Margaret smiled. Besides, if even 5 of those 20 people turn out to have skills we can use, the return on investment will be massive. And if it works here, we can scale it across the industry. Create a model that other companies can adopt. Turn your story from inspiring exception into replicable practice. Caleb thought about his old co-workers at Hartman Global, about the cleaning staff he'd ridden the subway with for years, many of whom spoke multiple languages, held degrees from their home countries, possessed skills and knowledge that their jobs never required them to use. I want full authority over the selection process, and I want the participants to have protection, no retaliation if they're assessed and end up staying in their current roles, no discrimination based on what we discover. Done. Klaus will handle the legal framework. Sarah can help with the employment law aspects. Rodriguez has already agreed to let you split your time between this project and your work with Vanguard. Margaret extended her hand. Do we have a deal? They shook on it, and Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Not anxiety or imposter syndrome or the complicated weight of unwanted visibility, just clarity, purpose. The sense that maybe all of this, the lobby confrontation, the media circus, even Evelyn's desperate attempts at destruction, had been leading somewhere meaningful. The program launched 6 weeks later with more media attention than Caleb would have preferred. Every step was documented, analyzed, turned into content for an audience hungry for feel-good stories about corporate responsibility. But beneath the performance, something real was happening. The first participant was a woman named Rosa Martinez, who'd been cleaning Winchester's research facilities for 8 years. During her assessment, they discovered she had an advanced degree in chemistry from a Mexican university and had actually been reading the researchers' papers while emptying their trash, occasionally spotting errors in their calculations. Within 3 months, she was working in the lab she used to clean, her insights into chemical processes proving valuable enough that Winchester offered her a full-time research position. The second was a security guard named James Chen, who turned out to be fluent in Mandarin, Cantonese, and 3 Chinese dialects. He'd been watching Winchester's negotiations with Chinese partners for years, understanding exactly where communication broke down, but never having anyone ask for his perspective. He became their lead cultural liaison for Asian markets, his salary tripling overnight. Then there was Marcus, not the journalist, but a maintenance worker who'd taught himself coding from library computers and had been mentally debugging the building's security systems for years. Sarah from food services, who spoke 5 languages, learned from soap operas and romance novels. David from the mailroom, who had an encyclopedic knowledge of international shipping regulations from years of processing packages. Not all 20 assessments resulted in dramatic career changes. Some people were happy in their current roles and simply appreciated being asked about their capabilities. Others had skills that didn't translate to corporate needs, but were valuable in other contexts. One woman's talent for mediation led to her becoming a community organizer, funded by a Winchester grant. But the ones who did transition created ripples that spread far beyond Winchester Technologies. Other companies started reaching out, asking about the program's structure. Universities invited Caleb to speak about identifying non-traditional talent. The story evolved from human interest piece to case study in corporate innovation. And through it all, Caleb found himself becoming something he'd never expected, a bridge between worlds that rarely communicated. He understood both sides, the invisible workers who saw everything and the executives who saw nothing, and could translate not just languages but experiences, perspectives, entire worldviews that existed in the same buildings but never intersected. 6 months after the program launched, Rodriguez called an all-hands meeting at Vanguard International. Caleb walked into a conference room to find not just the usual team, but Rosa Martinez, James Chen, Marcus the Coder, and a dozen others whose lives had changed through the Winchester Initiative. "We're expanding," Rodriguez announced without preamble. Vanguard is creating a new division focused entirely on cross-cultural communication and talent identification. Caleb will be leading it. Our mission is to help companies around the world stop wasting the talent they're already paying for, to make what happened here replicable, scalable, and eventually standard practice. The room erupted in applause. Caleb felt Klaus clap him on the shoulder, felt Sarah's approving smile, felt the weight of 24 people whose transformation he'd helped facilitate, now supporting his own continued evolution. But the moment that mattered most came later, in Rodriguez's office, when it was just the two of them and the city lights beyond the windows. "You did it," Rodriguez said quietly. "You took your pain and anger and that terrible moment in the lobby, and you built something that will outlast all of us. That's not just success, that's legacy." "It's not enough," Caleb said. "For every person we've helped, there are thousands still invisible, millions probably. This program is a drop in an ocean. Every ocean is made of drops." Rodriguez poured 2 glasses of whiskey, something Caleb had learned he only did for significant occasions. "You can't save everyone, Caleb, but you can prove it's possible to save someone. You can create a model that others can follow. You can be the evidence that the system can change, even if it changes slowly." They drank in comfortable silence. 2 men whose collision had been accidental but whose partnership had become something neither could have predicted. Caleb thought about Evelyn in the park, about her confession of fear and inadequacy. He'd never told anyone about that conversation, keeping her vulnerability private the way she'd never kept his. "Do you ever wonder about her?" Rodriguez asked, as if reading his thoughts. "About what she's doing now?" "Sometimes." Caleb had followed Evelyn's story peripherally. The legal charges had been reduced through plea bargains. She'd lost her position at Hartman Global but had avoided jail time. Rumors suggested she was teaching business ethics at a small college upstate, which felt like either cosmic irony or genuine redemption, depending on your perspective. "I got a letter from her," Rodriguez said, surprising Caleb completely. "About a month ago. She wanted me to know that she's been following the Winchester program. Said it was what she should have built at Hartman instead of focusing exclusively on profit margins and market dominance." He pulled out his phone, found an email, read aloud. "Tell Mr. Moore that he's doing what I was too afraid to do, admitting that the system is broken and actually trying to fix it rather than just succeeding within its brokenness. He's a better business person than I ever was, even if it took me losing everything to see it." Caleb felt something complicated move through his chest. Not quite forgiveness. He wasn't sure forgiveness was his to give or that Evelyn was asking for it. But maybe understanding. Maybe the recognition that people were more than their worst moments, more than their fears and failures and desperate attempts to protect themselves from truth. "Did you respond?" Caleb asked. "I thanked her for the letter and wished her well in her teaching. What else is there to say? She destroyed herself trying to destroy you, and now you're both rebuilding in different ways. That's as close to a happy ending as real life offers." The months continued to unfold with the relentless momentum of transformation. Caleb's division at Vanguard grew from a pilot program to a full department with 12 employees, most of them recruited from service positions at various companies. The Winchester model was adopted by 17 major corporations in the first year alone. Caleb found himself speaking at conferences, being interviewed on podcasts, serving as an advisor to HR departments trying to rethink their approach to talent recognition. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does, replaced by newer stories and fresher controversies. But the work continued. The lives kept changing. The invisible kept becoming visible, one person at a time. On the 1-year anniversary of the lobby incident, Sarah organized a celebration at Vanguard's offices. Everyone who'd been part of the journey was there. Rodriguez and Klaus, Margaret Winchester, the participants from the talent program, even Marcus Webb, the journalist, who was working on a follow-up piece about the program's expansion. Caleb stood in front of the group, looking at faces that had become familiar over the past year, and tried to find words adequate to the moment. "A year ago," he began, I was invisible. I'd spent my entire adult life being looked through, dismissed, treated as if my intelligence and capabilities didn't exist because my job was cleaning floors instead of sitting in boardrooms. And I thought that was just how the world worked, that some people mattered and others didn't. And I'd been assigned to the category that didn't. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then one night, I made a choice. I spoke up when staying silent would have been safer. I revealed myself when invisibility had protected me for years, and it cost me everything I'd built. I lost my job, lost my safety, lost the comfortable anonymity that had made life bearable. Rosa Martinez was nodding. She understood. They all understood. But I gained something more valuable. I gained the knowledge that invisibility isn't protection, it's prison. That safety isn't the same as dignity. That being overlooked feels safe right up until the moment you realize you've spent your whole life never being truly seen. Caleb looked around the room. Everyone in this room has made that same choice at some point. You've chosen visibility over safety. You've chosen to believe you deserve more than the role circumstances assigned you. And because of that choice, the world is different. Not perfect, not fixed, but different, better, more honest about its own limitations. He raised his glass. So here's to being seen, to being recognized, to refusing to stay invisible even when visibility is terrifying, and to building a world where talent matters more than credentials, where capability matters more than comfort, where humanity matters more than hierarchy. To being seen, the room echoed, glasses raised in solidarity and celebration and the complicated triumph of survival. Later, after most people had left and the office had returned to its usual quiet, Caleb found himself alone in the conference room where he'd first been briefed on the Winchester deal. He looked out at the city, at the thousands of windows lit against the night, and wondered how many contained people like he'd been. Brilliant and invisible, capable and dismissed, seeing everything while being seen by no one. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I saw the article about your program's expansion. It's remarkable work. You're changing lives. I hope you know that. I hope you're proud. E.H. Caleb stared at the message for a long time. He could respond, could acknowledge Evelyn's attempt at reconciliation, could offer some platitude about forgiveness or moving forward or water under bridges. Instead, he just saved the message and put his phone away. Some stories didn't need neat endings. Some relationships didn't need resolution. Sometimes it was enough to know that both people had survived their collision, had learned something from the wreckage, and were building different lives in the aftermath. He thought about the lobby one last time, about the moment when Evelyn had grabbed his mop and laughed while calling him worthless, about the fury and shame and desperate courage that had made him speak up anyway, about how that single moment had been a door he'd walked through into a completely different life. The water stain on his apartment ceiling looked like South America. This office window looked like the entire world, lit up and waiting. Between those two views was the distance he'd traveled, measured not in money or status, but in the fundamental shift from invisible to visible, from dismissed to valued, from silent to heard. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Klaus. Stop brooding in dark offices and come get drinks. We're celebrating. Caleb smiled and headed for the door. Behind him, the city continued its indifferent rotation, full of invisible people waiting for their moment, full of potential collisions that might change everything, full of the messy, complicated, imperfect possibility of transformation. He didn't know if the system would ever truly change, didn't know if his work would scale beyond a few dozen lives, a few inspired companies, a few temporary shifts in corporate consciousness. The cynical part of him suspected that in 5 years, 10 years, the world would return to its comfortable patterns of overlooking the overlooked, of measuring worth by the wrong metrics, of keeping people invisible because their visibility would be inconvenient. But he also knew this. Tonight, Rosa Martinez was doing chemistry research instead of cleaning labs. James Chen was negotiating with Chinese partners instead of watching from behind a security desk. Marcus the coder was building software instead of fixing broken doors. And somewhere, in offices and buildings across the country, other invisible people were watching and wondering if maybe their invisibility didn't have to be permanent. That was enough. It had to be enough. Caleb turned off the lights and headed out to join his team, leaving the empty conference room behind. But he'd learned something in the past year that would stay with him forever. Empty rooms were never really empty. They were full of conversations people thought no one was hearing, full of mistakes people thought no one would catch, full of truths people thought they could hide in plain sight. And somewhere, always, there was someone invisible paying attention, someone who saw everything, someone who was just waiting for the moment when staying silent became more costly than speaking up. The world was full of those people. And now Caleb spent his days finding them, seeing them, giving them the chance he'd stumbled into by accident and transforming into something intentional and replicable. The lobby at Hartman Global had been the end of his old life. But it turned out endings and beginnings were the same thing, viewed from different angles. The moment you thought you'd lost everything was often the moment you discovered what you'd been carrying all along, invisible even to yourself until circumstances forced it into the light. Caleb walked out into the night, into the city that had watched his transformation with indifferent interest, into the future he was building one visible person at a time. Behind him, the Winchester Technologies building stood like a monument to capital and innovation and all the expected narratives about corporate success. But inside those walls, in the quiet spaces where no one was watching, the real revolution was happening. People who'd been invisible were learning to see themselves. People who'd been dismissed were discovering their worth. People who'd been silent were finding their voices. And it had all started with a mop, a lobby, and a man who'd finally decided that dignity mattered more than safety. That was the story, not the corporate deals or the media attention or the programs and initiatives and measured impacts. Just that single moment of choosing visibility over survival, of believing that being seen was worth the cost of being exposed, of trusting that somewhere on the other side of fear was a life worth living. Caleb had found that life. And now he spent his days helping others find theirs. The city lights reflected off glass towers as he walked toward the bar where his friends were waiting. Somewhere in those towers, someone was emptying trash while understanding the business conversations around them better than the executives having them. Someone was cleaning floors while mentally solving problems no one knew existed. Someone was being invisible while carrying talents that could change everything if anyone bothered to notice. Those were the people Caleb worked for now. Not the executives or the corporations or the system that measured worth in all the wrong ways, but the invisible ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who saw everything and were seen by no one, until now. Until finally, impossibly, someone was looking back and saying, "I see you, you matter, let's build something better together." And in the end, that was enough to change the world.